She was forced to watch the man she loved marry someone else, in a room full of people who wanted her to disappear. But when the most feared nobleman in Europe walked through those doors and chose her, London would never be the same. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who should have protected you, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, because what Eliza does will leave you speechless. Don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's go. The flowers had been Eliza's idea. That was the cruelest part. Not the wedding itself, not the vows she would be forced to witness, not even the knowing smiles of women who had whispered behind their fans all season long. No. The cruelest part was that 3 months ago she had stood in this very ballroom with Lord Charles Hartwell and told him, in the breathless, unguarded way of a woman who believed she was loved, that gardenias and white lilies together made the most beautiful arrangement she had ever seen. And now those exact flowers, gardenias and white lilies, twisted into cascading centerpieces that climbed toward the gilded ceiling like something from a painting, decorated every table at the wedding celebration of Lord Charles Hartwell and Miss Constance Belmore, the richest heiress in 3 counties. Eliza Rowan sat at a table near the far wall, close enough to the service corridor that she could smell the kitchen grease beneath the perfume of 200 guests, and she did not move. She had not moved in 40 minutes. Her spine was straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression arranged into something that she hoped, desperately, resembled composure. She had practiced this face in the mirror that morning. Serene, unbothered, above it. She was none of those things. "You really did come," said a voice beside her. She did not need to look. She recognized the particular brand of feigned sympathy in that tone, the kind that wanted her to crack open so the speaker could feast on whatever spilled out. "Lady Pemberton," Eliza said, without turning her head. Margaret Pemberton settled into the empty chair beside her with the casual confidence of someone who had never once questioned her right to occupy any space she chose. She was 40, handsome in the sharp-featured way of a woman who had survived 3 London seasons and 2 difficult husbands, and she had never liked Eliza. What she had liked was watching Eliza's brief, luminous courtship with Lord Hartwell, and now, evidently, she intended to enjoy its aftermath with equal enthusiasm. "I wasn't sure you'd have the nerve," Margaret continued, reaching for a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "After everything." "I was invited," Eliza said simply. "Oh, of course you were." Margaret's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Charles is nothing if not thorough in his cruelties. He always was." She paused, letting that land. "How are you managing truly? Your mother must be beside herself." Eliza's mother was, in fact, currently sitting at a table on the opposite side of the ballroom, her back turned firmly in Eliza's direction, engaged in animated conversation with 2 women whose names and fortunes would not suffer from proximity to the Rowan family's recent embarrassment. Her mother's message had been delivered without words, clearly and efficiently. "You're on your own tonight. Do not make this worse." "I'm perfectly well," Eliza said. Margaret made a soft sound, not quite a laugh, something worse, sympathetic, pitying, the sound of someone who had already decided the outcome of your story and was simply watching you arrive at it. "He told the Ashford set, you know," Margaret said, lowering her voice to the intimate register of a woman sharing a confidence she had every intention of spreading, "that you'd been overly attached, that you'd read things into his attentions that were never intended seriously." She tilted her head. "I thought you should hear it from someone who, someone who genuinely wishes you well." The music swelled. Across the ballroom, Lord Charles Hartwell moved through the crowd with his new wife on his arm. Constance Belmore Hartwell now, radiant in ivory silk, laughing at something her husband had murmured into her ear. Charles was handsome in the uncomplicated way of men who had never been required to develop character. Tall, golden-haired, the kind of face that portrait painters loved and women trusted far longer than they should. He caught Eliza's eye across the room. For one suspended moment, she saw it. The flicker of something almost like guilt, quickly buried. And then he smiled at her. A smooth, practiced, perfectly calibrated smile. The smile of a man who had already written the story of this chapter and cast himself as the reasonable one, overly attached. She had been courted for 4 months. He had called on her family. He had danced with her at 7 consecutive events. He had sat with her in the garden at Lady Forsyth's house party while fireflies moved through the warm evening air, and he had said, she remembered the exact words, because she had replayed them so many times since, "There is no one in a room quite like you, Eliza." She had believed him. That was the sum of her crime. She had believed him. "How lovely for them both," Eliza said. Margaret blinked, clearly expecting more. "I beg your pardon?" "Miss Belmore, Mrs. Hartwell. She looks very happy." Eliza finally looked at Margaret directly, and she kept her voice perfectly level. "That's all one can hope for, isn't it? That people find happiness." It was not what she felt. It was not even close to what she felt. But it was the only weapon available to her at this particular moment. The refusal to perform her own devastation for an audience that had already purchased tickets. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, and then turned away with the faint expression of someone who had been cheated of something they'd been promised. Eliza turned back to the room. She would not cry. She had made that decision in the carriage on the way here, sitting beside her mother's pointed silence and the slowly darkening London evening outside the window. She had made it with the particular cold clarity that comes after you have already cried everything out alone in a room where no one could see, and arrived at the hollow, glittering place on the other side. She would not cry. She would sit here for exactly as long as propriety required, and then she would leave, and she would begin the quiet, invisible work of rebuilding something from whatever was left. What was left, she was not entirely sure. It wasn't only Charles. That would have been survivable, painful, humiliating, but survivable. What was harder to reckon with was the architecture that had come down around him. The understanding developed slowly over the past weeks as invitations stopped arriving and conversations died when she entered rooms, that her value in this world had been largely conditional on his regard. That without it, she was, what? The daughter of a family with modest means and a father 3 years in his grave. A woman of 24 with no fortune, no title, and a reputation that had been quietly, efficiently dismantled by a man who needed her silence more than her presence. Overly attached. She watched the dancers move through the figures of a quadrille. She watched Charles Hartwell lean down and say something to his wife that made her laugh with her whole face, artless and genuine, and Eliza felt a complicated grief that had nothing to do with envy of Constance Belmore. She grieved the version of herself that had sat in the Firefly Garden and believed, fully and without reservation, that she was someone worth choosing. She was not sure that woman would come back. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. She almost didn't notice. The room was full, the music was loud, and she was deep inside the gray territory of her own thoughts. But a change moved through the crowd. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure. The way weather shifts before a storm, a subtle drop in temperature, an adjustment in the quality of light. She looked up. The man in the doorway was not particularly tall, or rather he was tall, but that wasn't what you noticed first. What you noticed first was stillness. In a room full of people who were constantly performing for each other, constantly in motion, laughing a little too loudly, gesturing a little too broadly, he simply stood there and let the room come to terms with him. He wore black, almost entirely, which was unusual enough for an evening celebration to be either a grave insult to the hosts or a statement so confident it transcended the category of insult entirely. Dark hair, sharp-angled face, eyes that moved across the ballroom with the measured, evaluative patience of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "Velasco," she heard a man near her mutter. The name moved through the room in a low current, whispered from mouth to ear and back again. She caught fragments. "Heard he ruined Marchetti in Vienna. The man never recovered. Something about his father, some sort of affair in Spain. Dangerous, they say. Absolutely ruthless when crossed. Why is he here? He can't know the Hartwells?" Duke Adrian Velasco of the Velasco Montoya estates, she recalled, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years absorbing the relentless social intelligence that London required for survival. A Spanish nobleman of significant power and more significant reputation. Not a reputation for charm or elegance or the comfortable social graces that English aristocracy preferred, but for something harder to categorize. He had appeared in London 3 months ago and moved through its most exclusive circles, with the unsettling ease of a man who did not need to be wanted in order to belong. Stories about him were unreliable and contradictory. He was ruthless, he was generous, he had ruined 3 men in business dealings, he had quietly funded the education of a dozen children in the East End. What everyone agreed on was that he was not to be handled carelessly. He was scanning the room. Eliza looked away. It was not her business who the Duke of Velasco was looking for, and she had enough to manage without adding the social complexity of whatever had brought him to a celebration he had no apparent connection to. She studied the surface of the table in front of her. She counted the petals on the nearest gardenia. 12. 13. 14. "You are Eliza Rowan," the voice came from directly above her. She looked up. He was standing at the edge of her table, close enough that she could see the quality of the fabric he wore. Exceptional, the kind of black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And the expression on his face, which was not what she expected. Not the polite fiction of social interest, not curiosity, not any of the 12 flavors of pity she had been served tonight. His expression was direct, evaluating. "I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment in that same still way he'd looked at the whole room, as if he was determining something, running some interior calculation. "I am Adrian Velasco," he said, and then, before she could respond, he continued, "I will be brief. I arrived tonight with a specific purpose, and that purpose has changed somewhat since I entered the room." "I beg your pardon. I need someone to stand beside." He said it without any apparent self-consciousness, the way a general might announce a tactical requirement. The circumstances would take too long to explain at this particular moment, but I have observed this room for approximately 3 minutes, and you appear to be the only person in it who is not attempting to impress someone. He paused. "Also, they are being spectacularly unkind to you, and I find that I object to it." Eliza stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined might happen to her tonight, this had not been among them, not even in the outermost regions of the possible. "You object to it," she repeated. "The flowers were yours," he said. "The gardenias and lilies." He told someone, several people probably, and they found their way to the arrangements. It's a very specific kind of cruelty, displaying another person's affections back at them. She felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth. She was too far past warmth for that, but something with an edge to it. The strange, painful relief of being seen accurately. "You've been in this room for 3 minutes," she said carefully. "How do you know about the flowers?" "I make it my business to know things before I enter rooms." He glanced across the ballroom toward Charles Hartwell, who was visible through the crowd, currently holding court with a group of men who were laughing appreciatively at something he'd said. Something about Adrian Velasco's gaze when it rested on Hartwell was very quiet and very cold. "I know rather a great deal about Lord Hartwell," he said. "None of it is flattering." Eliza's hands were still in her lap. She could feel her own heartbeat, which had become very loud and very specific in the past 60 seconds. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He looked back at her. "Pretend you're with me." The words were barely above a murmur, low enough that only she could hear them, intimate by necessity rather than intention. And yet the room seemed to sharpen around them. The music, the laughter, the smell of champagne and gardenias, all of it became suddenly, piercingly vivid. "Pretend," she said. "Yes. Take my arm. Speak to me as if you know me. It will benefit us both." He tilted his head slightly. "You have nothing to lose. You are currently sitting alone at a table near the kitchen entrance at the wedding of a man who spent 4 months making you believe he intended to marry you. Your reputation in this room is whatever they have decided it is. An alliance with me would change that calculation considerably." She should have said no. Every reasonable instinct she possessed, every lesson in caution she had ever absorbed from her mother's measured silences and the accumulated wisdom of women who had survived London's social machinery. Every one of those instincts said no. This was a strange man, a dangerous one by all accounts. His purposes were unclear and his explanation deliberately partial, and placing herself at his side would generate exactly the kind of attention that her mother had wordlessly begged her to avoid. But she looked across the room and she saw Charles Hartwell smile his smooth, calibrated smile at something his wife had said, and she felt, Underneath the grief and the humiliation and the cold exhaustion of the past several weeks, a small, hard, furious thing. She had been quiet for weeks. She had absorbed insult after insult with the gracious silence of a woman who understood that any display of feeling would only be used against her. She had arranged her face into serenity and sat near the kitchen and counted gardenia petals and asked nothing of anyone. "You have nothing to lose." She looked up at Adrian Velasco. His expression had not changed. He was waiting, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with the particular quality of a man who had extended an offer and was prepared to accept either answer without drama. "You'll need to tell me eventually," she said, "what you actually want." "Yes," he agreed, "I will." She rose from her chair. She was not a small woman. She stood nearly to his shoulder, which was taller than most of the men in the room would have liked. And when she took his offered arm, she felt the subtle shift in the immediate atmosphere around them. Two people nearby stopped their conversation. A woman, 3 tables over, turned her head. Adrian Velasco did not look around to observe the effect. He simply covered her gloved hand with his own, briefly, with the careful deliberateness of someone establishing a claim, and then he walked her directly into the center of the room. The music was still playing. The chandeliers still blazed. Nothing had changed and everything had changed, the way it sometimes does in the single instant between deciding something and acting on it. Lady Margaret Pemberton's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Lord Charles Hartwell, from across the room, finally saw her, really saw her, in the way he hadn't in months, the way people only see what they've discarded when they watch someone else pick it up. And his expression did something complicated and involuntary that Eliza noticed with a detached, quiet satisfaction before she looked away. "You're going to need to tell me something about yourself," Eliza said, in a low conversational tone, the kind one used with a long acquaintance. "If we're to do this convincingly." "That's fair," Adrian said. "What would you like to know?" "Why are you really here tonight?" He was quiet for a moment. They moved through the room together and she could feel the attention following them, the ripple of whispers, the recalibration happening in real time as people who had decided what she was revised their assessments. She kept her expression pleasant and distant, the face she'd practiced, except that this time it came easier. This time, she had something to stand beside. "There is a man in this room," Adrian said finally, "who has been in correspondence with someone in Spain who wants me dead. I came to see his face when he realized I knew." He paused. "I was not expecting to find you. And finding me changed your plans. It complicated them, in a way I haven't yet fully decided what to do with." He glanced down at her briefly. "You aren't frightened." "I am," she said honestly. "I'm simply not accustomed to letting it show." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. The ghost of a thing he'd apparently decided against. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you are." They had reached the far side of the room. Through the tall windows, London spread itself against the dark sky, lit and living, indifferent to the small dramas of its inhabitants. Eliza could see their reflection in the glass, herself and this man who was a stranger and, for reasons she had not yet fully examined, the only person in the room who had looked at her tonight without calculation. "The man in the room," she said quietly. "Who is he?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Someone I'll tell you about when we're not in public." "Are we in danger right now?" "No, he's more subtle than that." A pause. "He prefers to destroy from a distance. It's the preferred method of cowards." There was something in the way he said it, the controlled flatness of someone discussing a wound they'd learned to stop flinching from, that made her want to ask more. She restrained the impulse. There would be time. Or there wouldn't, and this evening would end and she would return to her quiet, diminished life, and he would return to whatever complicated war he was fighting in the ballrooms of London. Either way, she had 1 hour left in this room, and she intended to spend it on her feet. A man approached them. Sir Edmund Forsyth, broad and red-faced and well-meaning in the effortful way of people who have a reputation for it. "Velasco," he said, with the hearty relief of someone who had been wondering what to do with the foreign duke and had now been given an opening. "Didn't know you knew the Hartwell set." "I don't," Adrian said pleasantly. "I know Lady Eliza. I followed her lead." Sir Edmund blinked at her. She watched him recalibrate, saw him run through what he thought he knew about her and find it suddenly unreliable. It was extraordinary how quickly a person's entire social assessment of you could shift based on a single piece of new information. "Lady Eliza," he said, with a warmth that had not been present in his voice the two previous times he had acknowledged her existence at events this season. "You look remarkably well this evening." "Thank you, Sir Edmund," she said. "So do you." After he moved on, she felt Adrian's arm shift almost imperceptibly beneath her hand, a small private communication. She wasn't sure what it meant. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or something like amusement. "You're very composed," he said. "I've had practice." "So have I," he said, "though mine is the kind that comes from being in rooms where the stakes are somewhat higher than social approval." She considered this. "What kind of rooms?" He looked at her with those quiet, assessing eyes. "Rooms where people are deciding whether you live or die based on how well you manage what you put on your face." A beat of silence. "That's not so different from a London ballroom," she said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly beyond polite social rhythm. "No," he said, and his voice was different now. Not lower exactly, but stripped of some outer layer. "I suppose it isn't." The evening moved on. They circulated. They spoke to people, or rather people came to speak to them, which was a different thing entirely, and Eliza took note of the distinction with the part of her mind that was always quietly cataloging, always paying attention. 3 months of careful social navigation had given her comprehensive intelligence about every person of consequence in the room, and she found herself using it, mentioning the right names, navigating the subtle hierarchies of London's interlocking social sets, with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years learning to do it for survival. Adrian watched her do it. She could feel him watching. Not the uncomfortable scrutiny of an examiner, but the intent attention of someone cataloging something new. "You're remarkable at this," he said, between one conversation and the next. "I was raised to be." "That's not what I mean. You're not performing it. You're actually reading them. All of them, simultaneously." A pause. "Where did you learn that?" She thought about her father, 3 years gone, who had taught her to read people from the time she could read words, who had believed, firmly and without reservation, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was believe the face people showed the world, who had said, more than once, in the particular gentle way he had of saying important things, "The real story is always underneath, Eliza, and the real story is the one worth knowing." "Someone important," she said, "a long time ago." He didn't press. She was grateful for that. At some point, she lost track of the exact moment, she stopped performing composure and simply had it. The room was the same. The flowers were still gardenias and white lilies. Charles Hartwell was still moving through the evening with his wife, and somewhere in this room a man was corresponding with someone who wanted Adrian Velasco dead. None of that had changed. But she was standing up, and she was standing in the center of things. And the weight she'd arrived with, the gray, grinding weight of watching herself be subtracted from her own story, had, if not lifted, at least distributed itself differently. She was still in grief. She had not stopped being in grief. But she was in it on her feet, which felt, in the specific economy of this particular night, like something. It was an hour later when Lord Hartwell finally approached. She had known he would. She could read the social mathematics of it from across the room, could track his decision-making process in the way he kept drifting toward her section of the crowd and then being caught by his wife or his friends, and then drifting back again. He was managing something, guilt, perhaps, or vanity, or the specific discomfort of watching the narrative he'd constructed about her fail to hold. When he arrived, he was alone. His smile was the calibrated one, but there was something underneath it tonight that she had not seen before. Something tight. "Eliza," he said, "you look well. Very well." He glanced at Adrian, a careful, assessing glance. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with the Duke." "There are a great many things about me you weren't aware of," Eliza said pleasantly. She had not intended to say it, but once it was out, she found she did not wish to take it back. Charles's smile tightened by a fraction. I want you to know, I never intended, You don't need to explain anything to me, Charles, she said. Truly. And she meant it, she realized, with some surprise. Not because she'd forgiven him, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but because the explanation he was preparing to give her, the smooth and self-justifying account of how his choices had been reasonable and her expectations unreasonable, she didn't need to hear it. She already knew what it would sound like. She'd been hearing it in some form for months. Adrian had said nothing. He was simply standing beside her with that quality of stillness, his presence neither aggressive nor deferential, simply there, a fixed point in the room. Charles Hartwell looked at him once more. Something moved across his face that she might, in another context, have read as unease. I wish you well, Charles said finally to her. I genuinely do. I know, she said. He moved away. Adrian watched him go. He was afraid of something, he said, after a moment. Of me? No. A pause. Of me? But not for the reason you might think. He was quiet for a moment. The man I'm looking for in this room, Hartwell knows him. I can see it. He's been watching us all evening, and every time I've looked in Hartwell's direction, Hartwell has been avoiding my eye. She processed this. You think Charles is involved with whoever is trying to harm you? Not directly. He doesn't have the spine for it. There was no heat in Adrian's voice when he said it, just assessment, flat and clear. But he's a link in the chain. He received correspondence, I think, and passed it on, knowingly or otherwise. He glanced down at her. I'm sorry. This involves you now, through no fault of your own. I involved myself, she said. Yes, he said. You did. Again, that ghost of something in his expression. Why? She thought about how to answer this. The music had changed. Something slower now, a waltz, and the floor was filling with couples who wanted to be seen dancing at the wedding of the year. She watched them for a moment. Because I was tired, she said finally, of being the person in the corner, of being careful and small and invisible. She paused. And because you looked at me as if I was worth something, and I couldn't remember the last time someone had. He was quiet for a moment. You are worth a great deal, he said. Not warmly. That wasn't how he spoke. But with the steady, unadorned quality of a man saying something he'd decided was simply true and therefore worth stating. She believed him, which surprised her. She had spent 4 months not quite believing Charles Hartwell when he said things like that. Some part of her always waiting for the qualifier, the but, the slight withdrawal that came after sweetness. She had spent all that time wanting to believe him, working at it like a problem, and it had never quite taken. This she believed immediately, without effort, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Tell me about the enemy, she said. The man in Spain, the one who wants you dead. He looked at her. Tell me, she said again. Not because I'm owed it, because if you're going to spend this evening at my side in this room, I should know what I'm standing beside. Another silence. Outside, London continued its indifferent blaze. The waltz moved through its first refrain. His name is Rodrigo Castañeda, Adrian said. He was my father's most trusted advisor, and 3 years ago he arranged for my father to be killed so that he could seize control of everything the Velasco family built over 200 years. The words were quiet. Quiet in the way of things that have been said in silence for so long that they've become very dense, very compressed, said so many times inside one's own head that the external version comes out stripped of everything unnecessary. I'm sorry, she said. I have been in London gathering what I need to confront him, he continued. Evidence, alliances, legal instruments. He believes I'm weakened. He's been working to ensure it, spreading rumors, intercepting correspondence, ensuring that anyone I might turn to for support is given reason to doubt me. The letters to Charles. I suspect so. Hartwell has connections I need, financial, legal. If Castañeda poisons those connections before I can use them. He stopped. It doesn't matter. I'll manage it. She studied him, the angle of his jaw, the controlled stillness of a man who'd been managing an impossible thing alone for a long time. You came to London alone? She asked. With 2 men I trust, that's all. That's Well, against someone who has control of your family's estates and apparently a considerable network of influence. Yes, that is either very brave or very foolish, she said. It is very necessary, he said. Those are frequently the same thing. She thought about that. She thought about the man her father had been, a man who had also, in his own quieter way, chosen the necessary thing in the face of the reasonable objection again and again until the day he couldn't anymore. She thought about the particular loneliness of deciding to do something that cannot be undone and doing it anyway and carrying the weight of it without being able to put it down. The man in this room, she said, the link in the chain. Do you know which one he is? Not yet, but I will before the evening ends. She nodded slowly. Then let's keep moving, she said. You'll see better from the center of the room, and I know these people. If you tell me what you're looking for, I can help you find it. He looked at her with the still, evaluating look she was beginning to recognize. You understand, he said carefully, that helping me is not without risk. I understand, she said. Eliza. He said her name, for the first time, just her name, without the honorific, and it had a particular quality she couldn't quite categorize. I don't want to use you as an instrument. I know, she said. That's why I'm offering. Something settled in his expression, something that had been held taut. She hadn't noticed it until it released. Then yes, he said, let's move. They moved through the room together, and the evening opened up around them, complicated, dangerous, rearranged from everything it had been when she arrived. 3 hours ago, she had sat at a table near the kitchen entrance and counted petals and wondered if she would ever stop feeling like a person who had been subtracted from their own story. She was not subtracted tonight. She did not yet know what she was, could not have put language to the complicated, shifting thing happening inside her, the grief still present, the new alertness layered over it like a different season beginning before the last one has quite ended. She did not know who Adrian Velasco was, not really. She did not know where this evening was pointing, or what came next, or whether any of it would resolve into something that made sense in the morning light. But she was standing up, she was moving through the center of things, and beside her was a man who had walked into a room, looked across 200 people and seen her. Not the version of her that had been described by a man who needed her diminished, not the figure in the corner near the kitchen, not the cautionary tale. Her. Whatever that was worth, whatever it came to mean, it was, tonight, enough to move forward on. The chandeliers blazed above the dancing couples. The gardenias and white lilies poured their scent into the warm air. Somewhere in this room, a man who had helped murder a father was watching the Duke he'd meant to isolate walk through the crowd, accompanied by a woman he had not anticipated. And Eliza Rowan, who had arrived at this wedding intending only to survive it, had begun, without entirely meaning to, something she would not yet know how to name for several weeks, something that had the precise, particular quality of the moment before everything changes. She kept her chin up. She kept her hand steady on his arm. She kept moving. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The morning after the Hartwell wedding, London decided what to think about Eliza Rowan. It did not take long. It never did. By 10 o'clock, the story had been assembled from the various observations of the 200 people who had witnessed the evening, edited for maximum interest, and distributed across the drawing rooms and breakfast tables of Mayfair with the efficient, pitiless speed of a city that had been manufacturing social narratives for centuries. The version that emerged, the version that would prove most durable, most widely circulated, was not entirely false, which was what made it dangerous. Lady Eliza Rowan, publicly humiliated by Lord Hartwell's marriage, had attached herself to the foreign Duke Velasco in a brazen bid for attention. Whether the Duke was aware of being used in this fashion remained to be seen. The situation had all the hallmarks of desperation. She read it in Margaret Pemberton's expression when they crossed paths outside a milliner's shop on Bond Street at 10:30. She didn't need Margaret to say a word. The expression said everything. That particular combination of satisfaction and manufactured concern that London women had refined over generations into something almost indistinguishable from kindness. "My dear," Margaret began. "Good morning, Lady Pemberton," Eliza said, and walked past her without stopping. Her mother was waiting in the carriage. Catherine Rowan was a woman who had survived 26 years of London society on intelligence and careful management, and she had opinions about the previous evening that she had been containing since the moment Eliza climbed back into the carriage at midnight, and she was now, clearly, done containing them. "You were seen," her mother said, before the carriage door had fully closed. "I was there to be seen," Eliza said. "That was the arrangement." "The arrangement." Her mother repeated the word as if it had a smell. "Eliza, do you understand what they're saying?" "I have a reasonable idea. They're saying you made a spectacle of yourself. They're saying Velasco took pity on you and you clung to him like—" "He approached me," Eliza said. "He asked for my company. I gave it." "Why would he—" Her mother stopped, looked at her with the careful, penetrating assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading people. "What did he want?" The carriage moved through the morning traffic. Outside, London was gray and industrious, the streets full of people going about the business of being alive. Eliza watched a flower seller arrange her cart on the corner. Daffodils, yellow as optimism, improbably cheerful in the thin March light. "I'm not certain of everything," Eliza said carefully, "but he had reasons. They were his own, and I had reasons to accept." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He's dangerous." "I know. Not in the way London means it when they call men dangerous. Not merely unconventional or foreign or badly behaved at dinner. I mean—" She paused. "Your father would have known what I mean." Eliza felt the familiar ache that her father's name always produced, a bruise that had not faded in 3 years that she suspected never entirely would. "Yes," she said. "He would have." Another silence. The carriage swayed. Her mother looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and Eliza recognized the posture of a woman choosing between the thing she wanted to say and the thing she believed was wise. "Be careful," her mother said finally. Not a warning. Something more complicated, almost a blessing. "I intend to be," Eliza said. And then the note arrived at 3 o'clock. It was delivered by a man she didn't recognize. Not a livery servant, not a messenger boy, but a compact, quiet-faced man of about 35 who handed the sealed envelope to their butler with the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent years delivering things without being remembered. She opened it in the parlor, standing by the window because the light was better there. "I would ask that you call at Dunmore House at your convenience this afternoon. There are things I should explain, and I prefer not to put them in writing. If you bring a companion, that is entirely reasonable. V." She read it twice. She thought about her mother's face this morning. She thought about what Margaret Pemberton's expression would look like if she knew. She put on her coat and went alone. Dunmore House sat at the quieter end of a respectable street in Kensington. Not the grandest address London offered, but solid, substantial, the kind of property that spoke of means without advertising them. The man who had delivered the note answered the door himself and led her through a house that was furnished sparingly and well, with the slightly impersonal quality of a place that had been lived in for months rather than years. Not a home, a base of operations. Adrian was in the study, standing at a long table covered in papers and maps, and he looked up when she entered with an expression that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "You came alone," he said. "You said I could bring someone." "I said it was reasonable. I didn't expect you to." He moved a stack of papers to make a clear space and gestured toward the chair beside the table. "Sit, please." She sat. She looked at the table, the maps, the letters, the dense, careful handwriting that covered page after page. A picture was taking shape in her mind of what 3 years of solitary, patient pursuit actually looked like in its physical form. It looked exhausting. "You slept," she said. It was not quite a question. "Some." He sat across from her. In the gray afternoon light, without the controlled atmosphere of the ballroom, he looked different. Not less, exactly, but more human. There were shadows under his eyes that she hadn't seen the night before, or perhaps hadn't been looking for. "London is talking," he said. "Comprehensively," she agreed. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be. You warned me." She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me about Castañeda." He looked at her for a moment, that steady, evaluating look. Then he leaned back and began. Rodrigo Castañeda had been, for 20 years, the primary financial administrator of the Velasco estates, a position of extraordinary trust in a family whose holdings spanned vineyards in Andalusia, shipping concerns in Cadiz, and a land portfolio that had taken 2 centuries to assemble. He had been, by all external appearances, indispensable. He had also, for at least a decade, been systematically dismantling what he was entrusted to protect, siphoning assets, forging documents, building a parallel network of financial instruments that would allow him, at the right moment, to claim the entire estate for himself. That moment had come 3 years ago. Adrian's father, Rodrigo Velasco, had discovered the fraud. Not all of it, but enough. He had confronted Castañeda privately, intending to manage the situation without scandal, without the kind of public devastation that would damage the family's reputation and the livelihoods of everyone who depended on their estates. That private confrontation had cost him his life. The official account was an accident, Adrian said, a fall from a horse on the road between Cadiz and Seville. My father had been riding that road for 30 years. He could have ridden it in his sleep. His voice was flat, not cold exactly, more like a flame that has been burning so steadily for so long that it no longer flickers. By the time I reached home, Castañeda had positioned himself as the administrator of the estate in trust, citing documents that gave him authority in the event of my father's death, documents I had never seen, documents that appeared in the archive 3 days after my father's body was found. Forward, Eliza said, demonstrably if I can get the right eyes on them. The difficulty is that Castañeda has spent 3 years ensuring that the right eyes are looking elsewhere. He picked up one of the letters on the table and held it out to her. This was intercepted by one of my men last week. It was sent to a solicitor in London, a man named Fellows, who handles the financial interests of several English aristocratic families who have investments in Spanish trade concerns. She took the letter, read it carefully. Her Spanish was adequate. She'd had a good governess, and what she read made something cold settle at the base of her spine. The letter from Castañeda to the solicitor Fellows was smooth, urbane, and entirely persuasive. It described Adrian Velasco as an unstable young man of dissolute habits who had been attempting to defraud his own family's estate with the help of fraudulent legal claims. It suggested that any financial arrangements involving Velasco's name should be approached with extreme caution. It was the letter of a man who understood exactly how to destroy someone's credibility before they could defend themselves. He's cutting off every avenue, she said. Yes. How long has he been doing this? Since before I reached London. The network he's built here, the people he's reached, it's more extensive than I anticipated. He paused. Hartwell, I believe, received a version of this letter, or something like it, which is why he's been avoiding me. He has connections I need, and Castañeda has ensured he'll never use them on my behalf. She set the letter down. She thought about Charles Hartwell's face when he'd looked at Adrian across the ballroom, the tight, careful expression of a man managing an uncomfortable secret. Hartwell is not a bad man, she said slowly. He's a weak one. There's a difference. She looked up. If someone put a letter like this in front of him and dressed it up convincingly enough, he would believe it without much examination. He doesn't like complication. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one, she paused, which means he might be reachable. If he could be shown, clearly, undeniably, that the letter was fraudulent, that he'd been used as a conduit for a lie. Adrian was quiet. She could see him running the calculation, the same kind of calculation she'd watched him do the night before, rapid and private, arriving at some conclusion before the conversation had caught up. You're suggesting I approach him, he said. I'm suggesting I approach him, she said. He looked at her. Eliza, but he won't speak to you. You've become a figure in a story Castañeda wrote, and as long as you approach him yourself, he'll see what the story tells him to see. She spread her hands on the table. He owes me nothing, less than nothing, if we're accounting honestly. But he was not unkind to me last night. He felt guilty, which means some part of him is paying attention to the gap between what he believes and what he's been told. She paused. I know how to talk to Charles. I know what angle he'll hear from. The silence stretched. Outside, a carriage passed in the street. The fire in the grate shifted and settled. "You would be involving yourself further," he said. "I'm already involved. London has already decided I'm involved." She met his eyes directly. "I am not doing this for Charles Hartwell. I'm not doing it because I have some remaining hope there. I'm doing it because Castaneda is the kind of man who stays at large because people, reasonable, cautious people, decide that involvement isn't worth the risk. And I've spent the past several months being careful and small and reasonable, and I found it doesn't protect you from anything." Something moved across his face. Something more than the ghost of an expression this time, real and unguarded for just a moment before he brought it back. "You don't know me," he said. "You have no guarantee I'm not the version of this story that Castaneda has been distributing." "No," she agreed. "I don't have a guarantee." "Then why?" She thought about this, really thought about it, not performing thought, but actually sitting with the question, because it deserved one. "Because you looked at the flowers," she said finally, "and you understood what they meant. A man who is running a fraud doesn't bother to understand the suffering of the person he's using." She paused. "That letter in Castaneda's hand, that's how a man who doesn't see other people writes. You see people. I don't think you know how to stop." He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light moved on the floor between them. "All right," he said, "but not Hartwell yet. First, there's something else we need to do." He stood and moved to the side of the table, to the map she had been half studying since she sat down. She rose and stood beside him. The map was of London, not a decorative map, but a working one, covered in penciled notations and circled addresses and lines she couldn't yet read the meaning of. "The man at the wedding last night," he said, "the one I was looking for. I identified him before the evening ended." He set his finger on a circled point on the map, an address in the city near Threadneedle Street. "His name is Piers Alderton. He's a London merchant with significant shipping investments. He's also Castaneda's primary English contact, the man who receives his instructions and distributes them through the network here." "You found him last night?" "With considerable help from your reading of the room." He glanced at her briefly. "The moment you told me that the man in the corner near the orchestra was watching me every time I turned away but looking elsewhere each time I turned toward him, I knew it was him." She remembered that moment, the small observation she'd offered without realizing its weight, the way he'd gone very still for a moment and then relaxed. "What do you intend to do about him?" "That's the question." He straightened. "If I approach him directly, he'll alert Castaneda immediately, and whatever I've assembled will become worthless. Castaneda will bury the evidence before I can get it in front of anyone with authority." He turned to look at her fully. "I need him watched. I need to know who he meets with, what correspondence passes through his office, whether there's a safe or a strong room on the premises. I need it done discreetly enough that he doesn't know he's being watched." "And your two trusted men are good at direct confrontation, less good at subtlety in an English social context." A pause. "I don't suppose you know anyone with access to the Alderton household." She thought. The name was familiar in the way that every name in a certain tier of London commerce eventually became familiar to a woman who paid attention, not well known to her, not someone she'd spent time with, but there was something. She turned it over, looked for the thread. "His wife," she said slowly. "Mrs. Alderton, Georgina. She was at Lady Forsyth's spring gathering last year. She's been trying to move into the higher social tier for years. She has the money, but not the connections. She's been rejected from the committee of the Whitmore Charitable Society 3 times. She looked up. She desperately wants someone with a title to vouch for her. And you have a title." "I have access to people who could provide what she wants." She paused. "It's not pretty." "No," he said, "it isn't." She thought about Georgina Alderton, a round-faced, earnest woman in a yellow dress at Lady Forsyth's gathering, trying too hard, laughing a beat too early, wanting to be liked with the painful transparency of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise it. A woman who might not know anything about her husband's dealings, who might be, in her own way, as trapped in a story she hadn't written as Eliza herself had been. "I'll approach her differently than you might think," Eliza said. "I won't manipulate her." He looked at her with slight surprise. "I'll be honest with her," she said, "or as honest as I can be at this stage. I'll tell her I'm concerned about her husband's business dealings, that there are things she should know before her family becomes implicated in something she can't walk back from." She paused. "If she knows nothing, she'll want to protect herself. If she knows something, the offer of protection may be enough to bring her out." He was quiet. "It gives her agency," Eliza continued, "and it means that whatever she tells us, she's told us willingly, not because I've tricked it out of her." "You're protecting her," he said, "a woman you don't know." "I know what it's like to be in a position and not understand how you arrived there." She met his eyes. "I'm not doing it only for her sake, but I'm not going to pretend the consideration isn't there." Something settled in him. She could see it, the way she'd learned in one evening and one afternoon to read the subtle weather of his expressions. Something that had been held at an angle, held with slight reservation, settled into something easier. "Then we do it your way," he said. 1. She called on Georgina Alderton the following Tuesday. The 5 days between were not idle. They were perhaps the most densely occupied 5 days Eliza could recall, filled with the kind of activity that had no visible form, that could not be described at a dinner table or mentioned in a letter, that required total concentration and left no physical record. She and Adrian met at Dunmore House each afternoon. She would not have been able to say, if pressed, exactly when those afternoons stopped feeling like strategy sessions and began feeling like something else, something she was less comfortable categorizing, because the category would require her to acknowledge things she wasn't ready to look at directly. She knew only that the hours passed quickly, that the fire was always built up by the time she arrived, that he listened to her, not in the way of men who were waiting for you to stop talking, but in the way of men who were thinking with you, building on what you said, returning to it an hour later when something new connected to it. He was teaching her in those afternoons the geography of what he was trying to do, the legal instruments he'd assembled, the witnesses he'd located in Spain who were prepared under the right conditions to testify to what they knew about the night of his father's death. The financial evidence, complex, dense, requiring explanation, she absorbed slowly and then surprised herself by retaining. She was teaching him London, not its addresses or its social calendar. He knew those. The softer, harder-won knowledge, which people would move under what conditions, where the alliances that looked unbreakable actually had fault lines, how to say a thing without saying it in a way that an English aristocrat would hear as trustworthy rather than suspicious. "You are a genuinely remarkable strategist," he said, on the third afternoon with that directness she had stopped finding startling. "I mean that without flattery. My father believed that women were wasted on embroidery," she said. "He taught me chess when I was 6, argued policy with me at dinner from the time I was 12. She paused. He said that the best strategic minds he'd encountered were in people who had learned to move through the world with limited resources. That constraint was a better teacher than advantage. He was right, Adrian said, and there was something in his voice, a recognition that came from experience, the kind of recognition that only one person can give another when they have lived some version of the same truth. He would have liked you, she said, before she could think better of it. She watched him absorb that. He looked down at the papers in front of him, and when he looked up again, his expression was careful in a different way than usual. Not strategic care, but something more private, more vulnerable, in the specific way of people who have learned to hold vulnerability very still so it doesn't spill. That matters to me more than I would have expected, he said. She did not reply. Some things required the dignity of silence. Georgina Alderton received her in a drawing room that was expensively furnished in the way of people who have recently acquired the ability to buy expensive things and have not yet developed the confidence to stop demonstrating it. She was clearly delighted and clearly nervous, a combination that made her simultaneously very easy to read and genuinely, unexpectedly easy to like. "Lady Eliza," she said, with a warmth that was artless and real, I must admit, I was quite surprised by your note." "I'm sure you were," Eliza said. She sat, declined tea with a smile, and looked directly at Georgina Alderton with the clear, quiet look that her father had taught her, the one that said, "I see you fully, and I'm not here to harm you. Mrs. Alderton, I'm going to be more direct with you than is conventional. I hope you'll forgive that." Georgina blinked. "Of course." I'm here because I have some concern for your household's position in a situation that may become very complicated very soon. I want to make sure you are informed rather than blindsided. Not because I have a complete picture, I don't, but because I think you deserve to have what information there is. Georgina Alderton's hands, she noticed, had gone very still in her lap. What situation? Georgina said. And here was where Eliza made her choice. The choice she'd thought about for 5 days. The choice she'd discussed with Adrian, who had said it's your call in the way that meant he trusted her judgment and also meant he understood that if she was wrong, the consequences would be significant. She told Georgina Alderton, carefully and selectively, about Rodrigo Castañeda. She did not mention Adrian by name. She described a Spanish financial fraudster with London connections who was using an English merchant as an unknowing conduit. She chose the word unknowing deliberately and watched Georgina's face when she said it. She described the letters, the network, the nature of the fraud. She said, at the end, that when this came to light, and it would come to light because the evidence was accumulating beyond any possibility of suppression, anyone whose name appeared in the correspondence would face, at minimum, devastating public scrutiny. And that if there was any member of a household who could demonstrate that they had acted to expose rather than conceal the connection, that would matter considerably. Georgina Alderton sat very still for a long time after Eliza finished. You are not here, Georgina said carefully, simply out of concern for my welfare. No, Eliza said, but the concern is real. You want information. I want you to protect yourself. The information, if there is any, would be a consequence of that. Georgina looked at her. It was a long, searching look. The look of a woman who had spent years wanting to be included in things and had learned, in that wanting, to be very careful about what people said versus what they meant. My husband has a study, Georgina said finally, that I am not permitted to enter. He has told me this is because it contains sensitive business papers, and he doesn't want the housemaids disturbing them. She paused. He has not, in 11 years of marriage, ever locked a room against me before. The room was quiet. When did this begin? Eliza asked. 8 months ago. Georgina's voice was steady now, with the steadiness of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they've built the muscle for it. Around the time he began receiving letters from a Spanish correspondent. He burns them after he reads them. I didn't know that was unusual until... She stopped. Until now, I suppose. Eliza leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Alderton, Georgina. She waited until the woman looked directly at her. Is there anything in that study that you know the location of? A pause. Long enough that Eliza had time to understand what was at stake in it. Not just for herself and Adrian and the accumulated work of 3 years, but for this woman across from her who was making a decision about her own life in real time, in a drawing room that was too expensively furnished, with hands that had gone very still in her lap. There's a green ledger, Georgina said, on the second shelf. He moved it there from the locked drawer last week. I saw him through the door before he closed it. Another pause. I can have it on that table tomorrow morning. Eliza let out a slow breath. You understand what this might mean? Yes, Georgina said. I've understood it for 8 months. I just didn't have anywhere to put it until now. Wuss. She walked back to where the carriage was waiting, and she sat in it in the gray London afternoon and felt the weight of what had just happened settle into her fully. 5 days ago, she had been sitting alone near a kitchen entrance counting petals. Now she was carrying information that could dismantle a fraud that had taken 3 years to construct, holding the trust of a woman who had been sitting on a secret that cost her something to surrender, and moving through the world at the side of a man she could not have imagined a week ago. A man who was becoming, in ways she was not yet equipped to examine, something she was afraid to name. She thought about what Adrian had said the first night. You have nothing to lose. She was beginning to understand that this was no longer true. She had acquired things this week that she could lose, trust and purpose, and the particular warmth of being seen by someone who saw clearly. The stakes had changed in the precise inverse relationship to her circumstances. As her position had become more dangerous, she had become more fully herself. and more herself meant more to lose. She thought about Georgina Alderton's face when she said, "I just didn't have anywhere to put it until now." She thought about her father, who had believed in constraint as a teacher. She thought about Adrian and the fire built up in the study at Dunmore House, and the way he listened, and the way he'd said that matters to me more than I would have expected. And she stopped thinking about it deliberately, with the practiced discipline of a woman who had learned that some things were dangerous to look at too directly before you were ready for what you'd find. The carriage moved through London's afternoon. Tomorrow, Georgina Alderton would leave a green ledger on a table, and everything, Eliza knew with the quiet certainty of someone whose instincts had been sharpened by loss, was about to become significantly more complicated. She folded her hands in her lap, kept her expression composed. She was ready. The green ledger arrived the next morning at 8:30, not delivered to Dunmore House. That would have been too direct, too traceable. Georgina Alderton was frightened, and frightened people made careful choices when they were also intelligent. And Eliza had taken her measure accurately enough to know that she would not do anything as straightforward as sending a parcel to an address her husband might know. Instead, the ledger arrived wrapped in brown paper inside a copy of a ladies' magazine, delivered to the Rowan household by a housemaid who passed it to Eliza's own maid with the explanation that Mrs. Alderton was returning a borrowed pattern book. Eliza had it in her hands within the hour. She was in the carriage to Dunmore House within 20 minutes of that. Adrian was already at the table when she arrived, already working, the way she was beginning to understand he was always working, as if stillness itself had become something he couldn't entirely afford. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes went immediately to the parcel under her arm, and something in his face changed in the way of a man who has been holding a door shut through sheer physical force and has just been told that help is coming. "She delivered it," he said. "She did." Eliza set it on the table and unwrapped it herself, with her fingers that were steadier than she expected them to be. The ledger was unremarkable in appearance. Green cloth boards, the kind of thing that could sit on any merchant's shelf without attracting attention. She opened it to the first page and set it between them. Adrian leaned over it. She watched his face as he read. The controlled stillness, the focused attention, and then something she had not seen before. A tightening around the eyes, a quality of recognition that had grief underneath it. "It's his handwriting," Adrian said. He was not speaking to her, not exactly. "Castañeda's. I know it from 20 years of seeing him write in my father's house." She did not say anything. She let him read. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. She tracked the time by the clock on the mantel, not because she was impatient, but because she was attuned to him now in the way that days of close work and careful conversation had made her attuned. She understood the rhythm of his thinking, the way silence in him was active rather than absent, and she understood that these 11 minutes were significant, that something was happening in them that mattered. When he finally looked up, his expression was not triumphant. It was something more complicated and more difficult. "Eliza Beton," he said. "There are names in here that I didn't anticipate." She waited. "Fellows?" "Castañeda's solicitor contact." "Yes." "2 other London merchants I'd identified." "Hartwell." He paused. "And a name I have not seen before. A name that changes the picture considerably." He turned the ledger to face her and pointed to an entry dated 4 months prior. She read the name. Lord Cassius Drummond. She sat back. Lord Cassius Drummond was not merely a London aristocrat. He was a senior member of the Privy Council's Trade Advisory Board, a man with direct influence over commercial relations between England and Spain, a man whose endorsement or condemnation of a legal claim involving Spanish estates and English financial interests could determine whether that claim ever reached a court capable of adjudicating it. He was 60 years old, deeply embedded in the architecture of English power, and, she ran through the relevant intelligence quickly, had been a vocal proponent, in the past year, of strengthening English trade relationships with what he described in public addresses as the more commercially reliable elements of Spanish enterprise. Castañeda's operation. "He's not just a contact," she said. "No." Adrian's voice was very even. "He's a guarantor. These entries, the ledger is tracking payments to Drummond. 4 separate transfers over 10 months. In exchange for what, exactly, the ledger abbreviates, but the context makes it clear. He looked at her. Drummond has been using his position on the Trade Advisory Board to block any inquiry into Castañeda's estate management. Every time the question of the Velasco succession has come up through official channels, and it has come up 3 times because I have been working those channels from here, the inquiry has been quietly redirected. Drummond's hand is in each one. The fire in the grate, the clock on the mantel, the grey London morning pressing against the windows. If Drummond is implicated, Eliza said slowly, this becomes something significantly larger than fraud and a contested Spanish inheritance. Yes, this becomes a political scandal. An English lord on the Privy Council's advisory board accepting payments from a foreign criminal enterprise. She looked at him. Adrian, do you understand what this means for your situation? It means, he said, that I cannot take this through official channels. Not in England, not while Drummond is in his position. Any official inquiry I initiate will land on a desk that he has access to. He paused. It also means that when Castañeda discovers I have this ledger, and he will discover it because Alderton will notice it's gone, and when he does, he'll know. The response will not be subtle. How long do we have before Alderton notices? Georgina will have seen to that, Eliza said, thinking quickly. She's not careless. She'll have had a reason prepared for its absence. She paused. But you're right that it's temporary. Days, not weeks. Adrian stood. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the street below. The particular stillness of a man thinking at speed. She watched him. She had learned to read the quality of that stillness. This was not the stillness of someone who had arrived at an answer, but the stillness of someone who was running every available option to its conclusion and finding each one insufficient. There's a man in Brussels, he said finally, a magistrate with jurisdiction over international commercial fraud, specifically cases involving assets and fraudulent instruments crossing multiple national boundaries. His name is Laurent Bertrand. He's incorruptible, which is both his greatest virtue and the reason he's stationed in Brussels rather than somewhere more influential. He turned from the window. If I could get this ledger, along with the other evidence I've assembled, into his hands, bypassing the English system entirely, Drummond's protection becomes irrelevant. Brussels, she said. Yes. You would need to leave London. I would need to leave London, yes. A pause. She felt the weight of it, the geography of what he was describing, the distance and the exposure and the fact that London, complicated and dangerous as it had become, was at least terrain she knew. Beyond it was something else. Something she hadn't agreed to when she took his arm in a ballroom 8 days ago. She was surprised to find that this did not frighten her in the way she might have expected. What frightened her was what he said next. There's something else. He came back to the table, sat down, looked at her with the direct, unguarded look that he used when he was about to say something he would rather not. In the ledger, the most recent entry, 3 weeks ago. He turned to the last marked page and set his finger on a line near the bottom. She read it. It took her a moment to understand it. Then she read it again. The entry described a sum paid to a contact identified only by an initial, R, for the purpose of accelerated social discrediting of a target identified as the Velasco Heirs London resource. The date was 3 weeks ago, before the Hartwell wedding, before Adrian had approached her, before she had become visible. This isn't about me, she said carefully. This was written before we met, before I was involved. Yes, Adrian said, which means Castañeda had identified that I was building something here in London, that I had people around me, and he instructed someone to watch for anyone who might be useful to me and preemptively discredit them. He looked at her. The R contact was already in place, already watching. She sat with this for a moment, turned it over. Someone at the wedding, she said. I believe so. Someone who was already watching you when you arrived, who saw you approach me, who would have immediately understood what a social partnership between us could mean for your position here. She thought, ran through the room again in her memory, the faces, the positions, the flow of attention. And who would have gone to work that same night on the narrative? The narrative. Lady Eliza Rowan, publicly humiliated, attaches herself to the foreign duke in a brazen bid for attention. The story had been assembled with remarkable speed and efficiency. She had noted the efficiency at the time without fully examining it. Now she examined it. "It wasn't organic," she said. "The story London is telling about me. It was planted." "I believe so, yes." She felt something cold and very clear move through her. Not anger, something more refined than anger, the specific sensation of understanding a mechanism that had been operating on you without your knowledge, seeing its parts and its logic laid out in the light. "Then whoever R is," she said, "they are not simply a passive observer. They are active. They are in London. They move in these circles. They have access to the right ears." She looked at him. "Do you have any candidate?" "One," he said. "But I needed you to hear the context before I told you who." She waited. "Sir Edmund Forsyth," he said. She stared at him. Sir Edmund Forsyth, broad, red-faced, hearty Sir Edmund, who had approached them at the wedding with the open relief of a man given a social opening, who had been so warmly, newly attentive to her after years of the polite invisibility he'd offered her before, who had a robust shipping concern with, she thought, yes, connections to the Iberian trade routes, who was, she understood now with a nausea that was more intellectual than physical, positioned perfectly. Old money, old network, the kind of face that everyone trusted because it looked like a man who had never needed to be subtle. "How certain are you?" she asked. "The ledger uses an initial. It could be coincidence." He paused. "I don't believe in coincidence in this particular arena." "He was watching you at the wedding," she said. "Before you approached me. He would have seen—" She stopped. "He was the one who came to us. He approached us, within minutes of us joining. Yes, I noted that at the time. I thought he was curious. Now I think he was taking stock." She thought about the warmth of his greeting. "Lady Eliza, you look remarkably well this evening. The charm of it, the performance of it." "If it's Forsyth," she said, he knows about this." She gestured at the ledger. "Not the ledger specifically. He can't know Georgina Alderton moved it, but he knows the shape of what you're building. He's been watching it." "Yes." "And if Alderton notices the ledger is gone, Forsyth will know within hours. The fire. The clock. The gray morning." "We have less time than days," she said. "Significantly less," he agreed. They worked through the afternoon without stopping. Adrian's two trusted men, she had met them by now, a compact Spaniard named Marco and a taller, quieter man called Reyes, both of whom had the unhurried, economical manner of people accustomed to operating in difficult conditions, were sent out with specific instructions to watch the Alderton house, to watch Forsyth's residence on Cavendish Square, and to be ready. Ready for what? Adrian had not specified aloud. He didn't need to. They were the kind of men who understood the shape of a situation without requiring it to be described. Eliza sent a note to her mother, carefully worded, the kind of note that said little but implied more. That she was safe. That she was occupied with something important. That her mother should not expect her for dinner and should not be alarmed by anything she might hear in the next day or two. She read it over twice before she sent it, knowing her mother would read it with the same attention she had given everything for 26 years, and would understand, probably, more of the truth behind it than Eliza had intended to put there. She and Adrian ate dinner at the table in the study, surrounded by papers, cold meat and bread that someone had left, eaten standing mostly, talking through the logistics of what Brussels would require, what documents needed to travel with the ledger, what letters of introduction Adrian had, and from whom, and whether they would carry weight with Bertrand, whether there was a route out of London that bypassed the major coaching roads, the ones where someone watching for movement would watch first. "You keep saying we," Adrian said at some point in the early evening. She looked up. "I know. I haven't asked you to come with me." "No," she said. "I should point out that what I'm describing, the route to Brussels, the confrontation with Bertrand, and whatever response Castaneda makes when he realizes the ledger is gone, none of it is safe. It isn't an adventure. It's ugly and uncertain, and I cannot guarantee—" "Adrian," She said his name quietly, and he stopped. I am aware. He looked at her. The candlelight, it was evening now, the lamps lit, made his face something different from what it was in daylight. Less armored somehow, more of what lay underneath the strategy and the control. Why? He said. Not the rhetorical why of a man who didn't understand, the real one. The one that was asking something about herself that she might not yet have the full answer to. She was quiet for a moment, honest with herself about it in a way she had been avoiding all week, looking at it directly instead of at an angle. Because I have been living in a world where all my choices were made within the boundaries of what was safe, she said, and safe protected me from nothing. It didn't protect me from Charles, or from the story London told about me, or from the grief of finding out that the person I thought I was didn't survive the absence of someone else's regard. She paused. I would rather be afraid of something real than safe from something that was never going to hold. He was very still. And because, she continued more quietly, you are the first person in a long time who has shown me that the real story is worth knowing, even when it's difficult. My father taught me that. You reminded me of it. She looked at him across the table covered in papers. That's not nothing. The silence between them was different from the silences earlier in the week. It had a different weight, a different temperature. No, he said. It is very far from nothing. Neither of them said what was in the room between them. It wasn't time. The situation did not allow for it, and even if it had, they were both people who had learned through painful experience not to say things before they were sure they could be held. But it was there, present and acknowledged, the way some things can be known between two people without being spoken, the way weather exists before it breaks. He looked away first, back to the papers. We should sleep, he said. We'll need to move early. Morning? Before dawn, if possible. Marco will have a report from Cavendish Square by midnight. If Forsyth has moved, we may need to go tonight. She nodded. She would sleep here. There was a room, small and clean, that she'd used once before when a meeting had run into darkness and the streets weren't safe for a solitary carriage. She did not think about what London would say about that, or rather she thought about it briefly and set it aside with the brisk practicality she was developing for exactly these kinds of calculations. London's opinion of her had been weaponized against her before she had done anything to deserve it. She was no longer willing to arrange her life around the feelings of a city that had already decided she was a cautionary tale. Marco's report came at 11 o'clock. She heard Adrian's knock at her door at 11:30. 3 knocks, measured, the way he always did anything. Come in, she said. She was already awake. She wasn't sure she'd slept at all. He opened the door and stood in the frame. He did not come in, had never once done anything that could be read as presumptuousness, which she had noticed and filed away as evidence of the kind of man he was when no one was watching. He was already dressed, coat on, something in his expression that she recognized from the ballroom on the first night, the managed stillness of a man who had just received information and was deciding how to present it. Tell me, she said. Alderton went to Forsyth's residence at 10 o'clock, he said. He was inside for 40 minutes. He left with something under his arm. Marco described it as a wrapped parcel, similar in size to what Georgina described as the ledger. Her mind went very fast. A copy, she said. Castaneda didn't trust a single copy. There was a second ledger, or duplicate documents, at Forsyth's residence. That's my reading, yes. Which means Forsyth knows the original is gone, which means they know we have it, or suspect it. He paused. And in approximately, he checked the watch in his waistcoat. 8 hours, London will know something else. She went still. What? He came a step into the room then, reached into his coat and produced a folded page, a broadsheet, the kind that the scandal papers printed in the early hours for morning distribution. He held it out to her. She took it, read the headline in the guttering candlelight. Velasco fraud exposed. Foreign duke sought on charges of financial deception. Accomplice. She read the article in 40 seconds. It was thorough, specific, and devastatingly constructed. It described Adrian as the perpetrator of a complex financial fraud against his own family's estate, claimed he had forged documents to seize control of assets that legitimately belonged to a consortium of creditors, that he had fled Spain to avoid prosecution, that he had been operating in London to intimidate witnesses and suborn perjury. It named Eliza, by full name and title, as his co-conspirator. It described her as a woman of compromised character who had attached herself to a known criminal in exchange for financial consideration. There was, she noted distantly, a particular sentence near the end that described her as having deliberately cultivated the acquaintance of Mrs. Georgina Alderton under false pretenses in order to steal private documents. They knew about Georgina. They printed it tonight, she said. It will be on every breakfast table in London by 7 o'clock, he said, and there will be men at the door of this house by 8. She looked up from the broadsheet. Their eyes met across the small room. We have until 7, she said. We have until 7, he confirmed. She was already moving. She had been wearing most of her clothes, had not fully undressed for exactly this possibility, and she thought in the clear, rapid way of someone whose mind had finally been given something real to work with, something with actual stakes, and found that it worked better this way. Better than 4 months of careful social navigation toward a future that was never going to hold. Better than sitting near the kitchen entrance counting petals. Georgina, she said, if they know she moved the ledger, Marco is already at her door. She stopped, looked at him. You anticipated this. I anticipated this was possible. When I gave Marco his instructions this evening, one of them was to watch her house as well. He paused. She is being offered the option to leave London temporarily. Whether she takes it is her choice. She is not being used as an instrument. He said the last sentence deliberately. Because he had remembered what she'd said, she felt something move through her chest that was not the time or place. Right, she said. Brussels. Brussels. The route Marco has scouted avoids the main road south. There's a boat from Gravesend at 4 this morning, a commercial vessel, not a packet ship, bound for Antwerp. From Antwerp, Brussels is 5 hours. You had this planned. I had contingencies. He looked at her with that direct, stripped-back honesty he had. The thing she had come to trust above almost all other things, above charm and above intelligence, because it was rarer. I hope we would have more time. I'm sorry we don't. Stop apologizing, she said. It doesn't suit you. Something in his expression, that ghost of something, the thing she had catalogued since the first night, came closer to its full form in that moment than it ever had before. Not a smile exactly, but its full, honest precursor. All right, he said. She took 2 things from the room, the ledger, which had been under her pillow, an instinct she was glad of now, and the small leather case with her most necessary documents, which she had packed, she realized, without consciously deciding to pack it. Her mind had been making this decision longer than she had. They moved through London in the small hours with the city's nighttime world around them. The lamplighters finishing their rounds, the night soil carts on their long routes, the particular dense silence of a city that never fully sleeps but reaches, between 3 and 4 in the morning, something like its quietest hour. Marco led them by routes that avoided the well-lit thoroughfares. Reyes came behind. She didn't speak for most of it. Adrian didn't either. There was nothing to say that wasn't being communicated by the fact of their movement, the fact of walking side by side through the sleeping city toward whatever came next. She thought about her mother, would be waking in 4 hours to a London that had been handed a story about her daughter, a story assembled by a murderer's agent and printed in a scandal sheet that fed on exactly this kind of narrative. She thought about her mother's face when she read it. She thought about the measured, practical love of a woman who had survived everything London had thrown at her family and had done it by making herself small. She hoped, with the fierceness of someone sending a message into the dark, that her mother would understand. That the thing she was doing was not recklessness. That it was the opposite of recklessness. It was the most fully considered choice she had ever made with all available information, made with both eyes open. She thought her father would have understood. She kept walking. The docks at Gravesend smelled of salt and coal and the cold tidal Thames, and the Marin, a Dutch commercial vessel out of Antwerp, was exactly where Marco had said it would be, loading the last of a cargo of English woolens by lantern light. The captain, a broad-shouldered man named Hoex, received a folded paper from Adrian with the manner of a man who had received folded papers before and understood that the paper meant his questions had been answered before he asked them. "Passengers?" Hoax said, in accented English, looking between them. "Two," Adrian said. "Cabin is small. We'll manage." Hoax looked at Eliza, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of a seafaring man. "It will be cold on the water." "I've been cold before," she said. He nodded once, apparently satisfied, and moved to direct the last of the loading. She and Adrian stood at the railing as the Marin pulled away from the dock. London retreated behind them. The lights on the water, the dark bulk of the city against the pre-dawn sky, the accumulated weight of everything it had meant, and everything it had done to both of them. She watched it go without the grief she'd expected to feel. What she felt instead was something harder to name, something that had the texture of decision, of having chosen the shape of your own story rather than accepting the one that had been prepared for you. "Eliza," Adrian said. She turned. He was looking at her. Not at London, not at the water, at her. The lantern on the mast caught the edge of his face, the jawline, the careful eyes, the expression she had spent 10 days learning to read and was now, she thought, beginning to understand. "When this is finished," he said, "there is something I want to ask you." "What?" "Not now." He paused. "When it's finished, when we're on the other side of it, and you know everything there is to know, and you've had time to think without a crisis pressing on every side." He looked at her steadily. "I want to ask it when you're free to answer it clearly." She held his gaze across the lantern light and the cold river air and the sound of water against the hull. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the first night, the gardenias and white lilies, and the man who had walked through the doors and looked across 200 people and seen her. She thought about the question she already knew he was building toward, and the answer she suspected she already had, and the fact that he was right, that it needed to wait, that it needed the weight of a clear sky rather than a crisis, that he was someone who understood the value of saying things at the right time. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned back to the water. She turned back too. Ahead, the wide, dark estuary opening toward the sea, Belgium and a magistrate named Bertrand, and a green ledger that could bring down a murderer, an uncertain country, an unmade future. Behind them, she knew, though she couldn't see it from the water, wouldn't see it for hours yet, London was waking. 7 o'clock was coming. The broadsheets were landing on breakfast tables. Her name was in the headlines, and the story being told about her was a lie dressed as truth, constructed by a man who had decided she was a variable to be eliminated. She was not eliminated. She was on a boat on the Thames in the cold dark before dawn, carrying evidence that could collapse an empire of fraud, standing next to a man whose question she had already answered inside herself 3 days ago, and was simply waiting, with the particular discipline of two people who had both learned that the things worth having were worth waiting for. The lights of London disappeared behind the bend of the river. The Marin moved on into the dark. And somewhere in the city they had left behind, in an office on Cavendish Square, Sir Edmund Forsyth was reading a copy of the documents that Piers Alderton had carried to his door, was reading them and understanding with the specific cold clarity of a man who had underestimated his opponent that the ledger was gone, that the heir he'd been paid to isolate was no longer in London, that the woman he'd dismissed as a pawn had walked out of the game carrying the most important piece on the board. The river was very dark and very wide. She pulled her coat closer. She did not look back. The sea between England and the continent was rough that crossing. Not dangerously so. Captain Hoax had navigated worse water on worse vessels with worse cargo, and the Marin was a solid, honest ship that took the gray channel swells with the unpretentious competence of something built for work rather than appearance. But it was cold, and the wind had an edge to it that found the gaps in every coat, and the deck moved under your feet with the constant low reminder that you were a guest here, that this element belonged to something other than human certainty. Eliza stood at the bow for most of the crossing. She had tried the cabin, small and wood-smelling, the bunk narrow, the lantern swinging with the motion of the boat. and found that the movement was worse when she couldn't see the horizon. So she came back up and stood at the railing with the wind in her face and the cold working its way through her coat, and she found that she preferred this. The discomfort was honest. It was real in a way that required nothing from her except endurance, and endurance was something she had in supply. Adrian came to stand beside her after an hour. He didn't speak immediately. He stood the way he always stood, contained, present, not requiring the silence to be filled. She had come to value this about him in the particular deep way you value things you didn't know you needed until you had them, the absence of the pressure to perform, to be something, to justify the space she occupied. "How long to Antwerp?" she asked. "Hoke says 6 hours if the wind holds, 8 if it turns." He looked at the horizon, flat and gray, the line between sea and sky almost indistinguishable in the overcast morning. "We'll be in Brussels by evening." "And Bertrand, you've corresponded with him?" "Once, 8 months ago, through an intermediary. He knows the shape of the case, not the specific evidence, but the outline. He agreed to a preliminary meeting if I could produce substantiating documents." He paused. "He did not agree to anything beyond that. He's cautious." "Cautious is appropriate," she said, "for a man in his position." "Yes." The water moved beneath them. A gull crossed the sky overhead and disappeared. "Tell me about him," she said. "Bertrand, what kind of man is he?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was deciding not how to answer, but how much. She had learned to recognize this too, the specific texture of his thinking, the difference between the pause that was calculation and the pause that was care. "He is 63 years old," Adrian said. "He was a criminal magistrate in Paris for 20 years before a political situation, I don't know all the details, resulted in his reassignment to Brussels. He considers it an exile. He handles it by working twice as hard as anyone requires him to, on cases that no one with ambition would take because the evidence is complex and the perpetrators are sufficiently connected to make outcomes uncertain." He paused. "He is not a comfortable man. He's particular about process, which means the ledger alone won't be sufficient. He will want the chain of evidence established, the provenance documented, the witnesses identified. He will take no shortcuts and allow none." "Good," she said. "I thought you might say that." "A man who takes shortcuts would be manageable by Castaneda," she said. "A man who doesn't is harder to reach." "Yes. He is also—" Adrian stopped. "He lost a son some years ago. To fraud, in a way. The boy invested everything in a venture that was deliberately misrepresented, and when it collapsed, he had nothing. He died shortly after, in circumstances that his father has always believed were not accidental." He looked at her. "I tell you this not to manipulate the situation. I would not use a man's grief as a lever. But it means he understands what is at stake in cases like this in a way that a purely professional interest cannot produce." She thought about that. About the particular quality of motivation that comes from personal loss. The way it clarifies, the way it makes you able to bear things that comfort cannot prepare you for. She thought about her father, about Adrian's father, about the invisible thread of ordinary devastating human loss that connected so many of the people who ended up in the middle of necessary, terrible things. "He will listen," she said. "I believe so." The Marin moved on through the gray morning water. England was behind them, invisible now, no longer even a suggestion on the horizon. And ahead, somewhere through the overcast, was a continent and a magistrate, and the next part of what their lives had become. She thought about the broadsheet, the headline, her name in print in the particular way that made a woman into a category, accomplice, woman of compromised character, operating under false pretenses. She thought about her mother reading it over breakfast in the Rowan house, and the cold, specific courage that would require. She thought about Georgina Alderton, and whether Marco had reached her in time, whether she had accepted the option to leave, whether she was safe. She thought about Forsyth on Cavendish Square, reading the documents Alderton had brought him, understanding that something had moved out of his reach. "I want to write a letter," she said, "before we reach Antwerp. If there's paper and ink aboard." "There is. What for?" "My mother," she said. Not an explanation, so she'll read the broadsheet, and the explanation is too long for a letter written at sea. But she needs to know I'm not frightened. She needs to know I made this choice deliberately. She paused. She spent 26 years being careful on my behalf. She deserves to know that the carefulness is finished. Adrian went below and returned with paper and a small bottle of ink held steady against the motion of the boat, and she sat on a coil of rope near the mast and wrote in the handwriting that her father had taught her, clear, upright, unafraid of the space it occupied. She wrote, "I am well. I am not running from anything. I am going towards something, and I chose it with my full mind. The story London is telling is a lie constructed by a man who murders and steals and is afraid that I am helping to stop him. I expect you already understand this. I love you. I will write again when I can." She sealed it and gave it to Hoax to post from Antwerp. Adrian watched her do it without comment. When she turned back, he was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the one that came close to its full form and then was managed back, contained, not because he was hiding something, but because he was a man who had learned to hold things carefully, and some habits of protection took time to unlearn. "You are," he said, "the most completely yourself person I have ever met." She looked at him. "I'm not sure that's always been true." "No," he said, "but it is now." He paused. "This version of you, I think she was always there. I think she was waiting for the right circumstances to surface." She thought about that, about the ballroom and the corner near the kitchen, and the careful, managed face she'd worn like armor, and all the months before that of arranging herself within the boundaries of what was safe, and finding that the boundaries kept contracting, kept requiring smaller and smaller versions of her, until she had been reduced to counting petals in a room that smelled of flowers she'd chosen for someone else. "She needed the right opposition," Eliza said finally. Adrian understood. She could see it in the way he received the words, not as an abstraction, but as something specific, something he had felt in himself too, the way difficulty had clarified rather than diminished both of them. "Yes," he said, "she did." Antwerp in the late afternoon was all gabled houses and cathedral spires and the smell of the port, fish and coal, and the particular international density of a city that had been at the intersection of things for centuries. They left the Marin with quick handshakes for Captain Hoax and moved through the port with the purposeful, inconspicuous pace that Marco had spent 3 weeks teaching Adrian, and that Adrian had, over the past 10 days, begun teaching Eliza without making a lesson of it, just moving, watching, choosing routes, not by what was fastest, but by what offered the most visibility and the most exits. She found she had a natural aptitude for it. Reyes had arranged a carriage, waiting near the secondary port gate, a plain vehicle with a driver who asked nothing and was paid enough to maintain that position. They were in it and moving within 15 minutes of disembarking. Brussels by 9, if the roads held. The roads held. They were in Brussels by 8:30. Bam! Laurent Bertrand lived and worked in a building on the Rue des Colonies that had the austere, serious face of a place that had never bothered with charm. Stone-fronted, narrow-windowed, built to last rather than to impress. His housekeeper, a woman of approximately 60, with the expression of someone who had been warding off inconvenient visitors for decades, opened the door to Adrian's knock with the comprehensive suspicion of a professional. "Monsieur Bertrand does not receive visitors after 8 o'clock, she said in French. "Tell him it's Velasco," Adrian said in the same language. "Tell him the evidence he was promised is in my hand, and there is a reason it cannot wait until morning." The housekeeper looked at him, looked at Eliza, looked at the worn leather case Adrian carried. She made the calculation of a woman who had seen, in her employer's service, a sufficient variety of urgent situations to know the difference between the manufactured urgency of the self-important and the genuine article. She stood aside. Bertrand was in his study, a room that made Adrian's table at Dunmore House look orderly, floor to ceiling with papers and volumes, and the accumulated physical evidence of a career spent pursuing things other people had tried to hide. He was a small man, which surprised her. She had constructed someone larger from Adrian's description. Small and fine-featured and white-haired, with eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles that had the particular focused clarity of someone whose mind was always, even at rest, in motion. He looked at Adrian for a long moment without speaking. "You are thinner than I expected," he said in accented English, apparently deciding on that language on some private basis. "It has been a difficult year," Adrian said. "Evidently." His eyes moved to Eliza. "And this is?" "Eliza Rowan," she said, before Adrian could answer for her. "I am the woman whose name was in the London scandal sheets this morning as Adrian Velasco's accomplice. I carried the primary document here from London. I am also," she paused, deciding as she spoke, "a witness to several things that will be relevant to your assessment." Bertrand looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a quality of attention that sharpened. "Sit down," he said, "both of you, and begin at the beginning." They talked for 4 hours. She had not fully anticipated what 4 hours would feel like. The systematic, disciplined, exhausting work of laying out a case for a man who accepted nothing at face value and demanded that every assertion be supported and every gap in the evidence acknowledged rather than papered over. Bertrand interrupted constantly. He asked questions that were precise and uncomfortable, that required her and Adrian to confront the weak points in their account rather than sliding past them. He made notes in the small, dense handwriting of someone who had been taking notes for 40 years and had long ago made peace with the fact that no one else would ever be able to read them. He was, she decided within the first hour, extraordinary. The ledger he examined with the focused intensity of a surgeon, handling it with cotton-gloved hands, examining the binding, the paper stock, the ink. He asked about the chain of possession from the moment it left the Alderton house to the moment it arrived in his hands, and she answered every step of that chain clearly and completely, including her own role, including the conversation with Georgina Alderton, leaving nothing comfortable in the account. "You told this woman the truth about the risk," Bertrand said at one point. "Why? You could have manufactured a simpler story." "Because she deserved to make an informed choice," Eliza said, "and because the truth was more likely to produce what I needed than a fiction. People can usually feel the shape of a lie, even when they can't identify it exactly." Bertrand looked at her over his spectacles. "You are not a lawyer," he said. "No." "You should have been." He returned to the ledger. Around midnight, he set down his pen and took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes with the gesture of a man who had been doing this for a very long time and had not entirely stopped being surprised by what human beings were willing to do to each other for money. "Drummond," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone in water. "Yes," Adrian said, "you understand what it means to implicate a sitting member of the English Privy Council's advisory board in a case of international commercial fraud and complicity in murder." "I understand it thoroughly," Adrian said. "The English system will not move against him, not quickly, not willingly." Bertrand paused. "But I am not the English system." He picked up his spectacles again and put them back on, looked at the ledger, looked at the stack of supporting documents, the forged estate instruments, the witness statements from Spain, the financial trail that Adrian had spent 3 years assembling. "My jurisdiction covers commercial fraud crossing international boundaries with connection to Belgian-administered treaty ports. Castaneda's shipping operations, the ones he seized with your family's assets, pass through Antwerp." A pause. "They pass through Antwerp on every westward route." "Yes," Adrian said carefully. "Which gives me standing," Bertrand said. "Which gives me the ability to freeze those assets pending investigation under Belgian commercial law, independently of what England does or does not do about Drummond." He set his hands flat on the desk. "And an asset freeze, publicly registered, would make Drummond's investment in Castaneda's operation visible in the English financial records within, I would estimate, 72 hours of execution." The room was very quiet. "At which point," Eliza said slowly, working it through, "the English government would have no choice but to act, because the connection would be in the public record and every newspaper in Europe would have the story." "Precisely," Bertrand said. He looked at her with something that was, she thought, as close to approval as he was capable of producing. "The English are not fond of being made to do things, but they are very fond of appearing to have done the right thing when the alternative is appearing not to." He picked up his pen again. I will need 3 days to prepare the instruments. You will need to remain available to sign documents and to be here if I require additional verification. He paused. Do you have somewhere to stay in Brussels? We will find somewhere, Adrian said. There is an acceptable hotel on the Rue de la Loi. Tell them Bertrand sent you. The owner is a former associate. He was already writing. I will send word when I am ready. Do not, in the meantime, communicate with anyone in London except through routes you trust absolutely. Understood, Adrian said. They left at midnight. The street was cold and quiet. The old city settled into its nighttime state. Gas lamps on the corners, cobblestones slick with the evening's rain, a carriage somewhere in the distance. She and Adrian stood outside Bertrand's door for a moment, in the cold Belgian night, and she felt the specific, disorienting quality of having just watched something enormous begin to move. Like standing at the base of a very large structure and feeling the first tremor of it shifting. The sheer scale of the mechanism now in motion too large to be fully comprehended while you were still this close to it. He'll do it, she said. He'll do it, Adrian confirmed. 72 hours after the freeze, Drummond is exposed. And once Drummond is exposed, Castaneda loses his protection in England. Every legal instrument he's used to block your claim becomes vulnerable, Adrian said. Yes. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, the wet cobblestones, the lamplight. And she could see on his face the thing she had heard under his voice for days, the 3-year weight of it, the grief and the patience and the cost of carrying something this large, this far, without the luxury of putting it down. She could see it now, not as a closed and armored thing, but as something that had become, in the past hours, slightly lighter. Not gone, not resolved, but moving. Your father, she said quietly. He looked at her. He's going to get justice, she said. That's what this is. All of this. The ledger, Bertrand, the freeze, the 72 hours. It ends where your father should have been protected. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp on the corner threw a long shadow across the wet stones. Yes, he said. His voice was different than usual, stripped of the last layer of the control he'd maintained across 3 years and 2 countries and every room he'd entered alone. It does. She did not say anything else. Some things were not improved by more words. They walked to the hotel on the Rue de la Loi through the quiet Brussels night, and she thought about the 72 hours coming, and about what came after, and about a question that had not yet been asked and an answer she already carried. The 3 days in Brussels were not idle. They were, in some ways, the strangest 3 days of her life, suspended between what had been and what was coming. In a foreign city where no one knew her name, and the broadsheets from London took 2 days to arrive and could be read without the physical weight of everyone around her reading them simultaneously. She moved through Brussels with the particular lightness of someone who had temporarily stepped outside their own story and could see it more clearly for the distance. She and Adrian worked. There were documents to be reviewed, verified, organized into the sequence that Bertrand required. There were letters to be written to the witnesses in Spain, informing them that the moment they had been promised was approaching and the statements they had given Adrian in the previous year would be required. There was the careful, necessary work of building something that would hold under scrutiny, and she found that she was good at it, good at the organizational logic of it, at finding the gaps before Bertrand could, at anticipating the questions a hostile examiner would ask. Marco arrived from London on the second day with news. Georgina Alderton had left London with her children. She had gone, apparently, to a sister in Yorkshire, citing a need for country air, and the smoothness of her departure suggested she had been planning for contingency longer than anyone had realized. Her husband had not followed her. Piers Alderton was, according to Marco's contacts, in a state of controlled panic, meeting repeatedly with Forsyth, burning correspondence at a rate that suggested he was aware the walls were beginning to close. Forsyth himself had, on the morning after the broadsheet, attempted to use his social connections to place additional pressure on Adrian through a legal instrument, some sort of complaint filed with a city magistrate, alleging financial impropriety in Adrian's London dealings. It had been, Marco reported with the satisfaction of someone delivering good news, rejected within 24 hours. The magistrate who rejected it was, apparently, a man who had encountered Castaneda's network once before and had personal reasons to distrust anyone arriving with documents that were just slightly too neatly constructed. "The narrative is cracking," Eliza said when Marco finished. "At the edges," Adrian said. He was careful about optimism. She had learned this about him, the disciplined refusal to count anything before it was completed, the habit of a man who had been surprised by reversals too many times. "The center will hold until Bertrand acts." "The center will hold until Bertrand acts," she agreed, "and then it won't." On the second evening, she and Adrian walked along the Rue Royale in the cold, early spring twilight, because they had been inside for most of 2 days and the air was necessary, and Brussels in the early evening had a particular beauty that was different from London. Quieter, less aggressive. A city that had survived occupation and reinvention and had developed in response a kind of stable, unhurried dignity. "I keep thinking about Drummond," she said. "What happens to him?" "He'll be investigated, likely forced to resign from the advisory board. Whether a criminal case in England moves forward," Adrian shook his head. "The English establishment protects its own in the criminal sense. He will probably escape prosecution." "That's not enough." "No," he agreed. "But the financial consequences, the public exposure, the end of his influence, those are real, and they will prevent him from protecting anyone else the way he protected Castaneda." He paused. "Justice is rarely complete. It is more often a succession of incomplete victories that eventually add up to something approximating a reckoning." She thought about that, about her father and the way he had moved through the world, in incomplete victories, in the long work of building something real in a landscape that didn't make it easy, about the difference between the justice you wanted and the justice that was actually available, and the hard-won wisdom of knowing how to value the latter without losing sight of the former. "Your father would have understood that," she said. "He lived it," Adrian said. "Every day of his adult life. The Velasco estates were not built in a generation. They were built in slow, incomplete, recurring effort across 2 centuries. He paused. "He used to say that the measure of a thing was not whether it was finished in your time, but whether you moved it further than it was when you arrived." She walked beside him in the twilight and felt the truth of that settle into her, not as a consolation, but as something more permanent, more structural, the kind of thing you build your thinking on. "He sounds like someone I would have admired," she said. "You would have." He looked at her. "He would have admired you considerably more." Bertrand's messenger arrived at the hotel on the 3rd morning at 7 o'clock. "The instruments are prepared. Come at 9. Bring the ledger." She and Adrian were already dressed when it arrived. She suspected neither of them had slept more than a few hours. They went to Bertrand's office with the ledger and the full documentation case and sat across from him while he walked them through the freeze order with the methodical, unsparing precision of a man who understood that the strength of an instrument lay entirely in the care of its construction. It was an extraordinary document, clean and specific and rooted in the jurisdictional authority that Castaneda had inadvertently provided by routing his operation through Antwerp, the decision of a man who had believed himself untouchable, who had never imagined that the air he'd tried to isolate would find a route around every barrier except the one hiding in plain sight. Bertrand signed it at 9:10. Adrian signed as the claiming party. Eliza signed as a witness, her full name and title clear on the page. "The filing will be registered with the Antwerp Commercial Courts by this afternoon," Bertrand said, blotting the signatures with the careful attention he brought to everything. "It will be in the public record by tomorrow morning." He set down the blotter. "At that point, it is no longer in my hands alone. Other people will move. Some of them will move in your favor. Some will attempt to move against you." He looked at Adrian over his spectacles. "Are you ready for that?" "I have been ready for 3 years," Adrian said. Bertrand looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man who had spent a career determining the difference between people who said things and people who meant them. "Yes," Bertrand said. "I believe you have." He picked up his pen again, returning, already, to the work that never stopped. "You should know. I sent a letter yesterday to a colleague in London, a specific letter, addressed to a specific editor at a specific publication that has, in the past, demonstrated a willingness to print things that other publications decline." He paused without looking up. The editor will receive documentation that provides the substantiated counter-narrative to the broadsheet that ran your names. He will have it in hand before the freeze order is in the public record. Another pause. Timing, in these matters, is everything. Eliza looked at him. You anticipated this, she said. You had this sequenced before we arrived. I have had a preliminary understanding of this case for 8 months, Bertrand said mildly, still writing. I am not an impulsive man. He glanced up briefly. Go back to your hotel. Eat something. You both look like you've been crossing the channel in bad weather. She almost laughed. It came out as something more complicated. Relief and gratitude and the specific emotion that doesn't have a clean name. The one that comes when someone who didn't have to help decides to help with their full capacity. Thank you, she said. He waved a hand without looking up. Don't thank me. I'm doing my job. The public record opened at the Antwerp Commercial Courts at 3 in the afternoon. She and Adrian were in the hotel on the Rue de la Loi, and Marco was at the courts with instructions to send word immediately. The word arrived at 7 minutes past 3 in the form of Marco walking through the hotel door with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The expression of a man who has watched something fall that he has been waiting a long time to see fall. He said only, "It's done." Adrian stood very still. Then he sat down. Not the controlled, deliberate sitting of a man managing a situation, but the sitting down of someone whose legs have simply decided they are finished holding everything up for one moment. He sat, and he put both hands flat on the table in front of him, and he looked at them. She sat down beside him. Not across, beside. She placed her hand over his on the table, and he turned his hand and held hers with the grip of someone holding something they were afraid might not be real. Your father, she said quietly. Not a question. Yes. His voice was barely there. Yes. They sat like that for a long time in the hotel room on the Rue de la Loi in Brussels, while the late afternoon moved toward evening, and somewhere in the financial records of the Antwerp Commercial Courts, a murderer's empire was beginning, for the first time in 3 years, to shake. Marco left quietly. Reyes, who had appeared in the doorway, disappeared without a word. The two of them had the particular discretion of men who understood the difference between a moment that required their presence and a moment that required its opposite. She held his hand. He held hers. After a while, he said, When I left Spain 3 years ago, after they told me my father was dead, after I had read enough of what Castañeda had done to understand that I could not fight it there, not then. I stood on the dock at Cadiz in the dark, and I made a choice. He paused. I chose to believe that it was possible, that a man who had done what Castañeda did could be made to answer for it. I chose to believe it even when I had almost nothing to believe it with. He paused again. There were many days when I was not sure I had chosen correctly. But you had, she said. But I had. He looked at her. The evening was coming in through the window now, a soft gray-gold light that caught the room at a particular angle. His face in it was open in a way she had not seen before. Not the managed openness of someone who has decided to be transparent, but the involuntary openness of someone who has just set down a weight they had forgotten the full measure of. And you, he said. Me? I did not choose you. I walked into a room and you were there, and something in you, the thing you were doing in that corner, the refusal to perform your own suffering for a room full of people who wanted you to, I recognized it. He held her gaze. I have been alone in this for 3 years. I did not know until the past 10 days what a difference it would make not to be. She thought about the girl who had sat near the kitchen entrance. She thought about the woman who had walked out of that corner on the arm of a stranger and into the center of things, into danger and Brussels and a magistrate's office and this room. And she understood, clearly, without sentimentality, that the two were continuous, that one had required the other, that the loss and the humiliation and the grief had been the precise preparation for this. She did not say this. She held his hand in the evening light and let the moment be what it was. Outside the window, Brussels moved on in its stable, unhurried way. In London, she knew, tomorrow morning's papers would carry a different story. Bertrand's counter-narrative, clean and documented and sourced. In Antwerp, the freeze order was in the public record, and people were already reading it. and the network that Castaneda had spent a decade building was developing, in its foundations, the first hairline fractures that precede a collapse. The story was not finished. Castaneda was still in Spain, still in possession of what he had stolen, still a man who had murdered and believed he was beyond reach. But he was no longer beyond reach, and she and Adrian were no longer alone in reaching for him. She looked at their joined hands on the table. She thought about the question he'd said he would ask when they were on the other side, when there was clear sky, when she had time to answer it freely. They were not yet on the other side. There was still Spain ahead of them, and the confrontation that could not be avoided, and the final reckoning of everything Castaneda had done and continued to do. But this moment in the hotel room with the evening light coming in and the freeze order in the public record and his hand in hers, this was the first clear sky she had seen in a very long time. She was, she realized, not afraid of the question. She was ready for it. But first, the rest of the work. First, the road back to Spain, and the man who had taken everything from Adrian, and the evidence that was now, finally, in the hands of someone with the authority and the will to use it. First, the finish of the thing. Then, everything else. She squeezed his hand once, lightly, and he returned it, and they sat together in the Brussels evening as the last of the light moved off the floor and the city outside settled into its nighttime self, steady and old and indifferent to the small, enormous things that people decided in rooms like this one, decided and meant and would not take back. They left Brussels the following morning, not because the situation required immediate departure. The freeze order was filed, Bertrand's mechanisms were in motion, and there was, theoretically, a case for waiting in the safety of a neutral city while the various legal instruments did their work across international borders. Adrian had considered this. She had watched him consider it, in the early morning hours before dawn when neither of them were sleeping, sitting with coffee at the small table by the window while Brussels breathed in the dark outside. He had considered it and set it aside. Castaneda will move when the freeze order becomes public, he said. Not against the courts. He can't undo what Bertrand has done, but against the witnesses in Spain, the people who gave me statements last year. He knows who they are. He's known for months, and he's left them alone because he believed he had time. He looked at her. He no longer has time, and frightened men with nothing left to lose are dangerous to the people they can still reach. The witnesses need to know what's coming, she said. They need more than knowledge. They need to be moved to somewhere he can't reach them before the judicial process can protect them formally. He paused. I have to go back. She had known this was coming. She had known it since Bertrand's office, since the freeze order, since the moment the mechanism began moving and the shape of what remained became visible. She had spent the night making her own calculation. Not whether she would go, which had never really been in question, but what going meant, what she was choosing, what she was walking toward with both eyes open. Then we go back, she said. Go. He looked at her across the small table in the pre-dawn dark, and she met his eyes and held them. And the question that had not yet been asked was present in the room between them, with a weight and a warmth that had nothing to do with tactics or timing, and everything to do with the thing that had been growing between them since a ballroom in London, since gardenias and white lilies, and a man who had understood what flowers meant. Spain, he said. Spain, she confirmed. The journey south took 9 days. They moved through France by road and river, sometimes by commercial coach, twice by private arrangement when the routes required it. Marco and Reyes traveled with them, not ostentatiously, not in a formation that announced itself, but in the quiet, distributed way of men who understood that protection was most effective when it was invisible. They stopped at inn towns along the way, Reims, Lyon, Avignon, and in each place Adrian sent and received correspondence through channels he'd spent years establishing, the invisible infrastructure of a campaign that had been running in one form or another since the night he'd stood on a dock in Cadiz and decided to believe it was possible. Bertrand wrote on the 5th day. The letter reached them in a coaching inn outside Perpignan, delivered by a messenger who had ridden through the night to catch them. The London publication had run the counter-narrative. 3 sentences of Bertrand's letter concerned this directly, and they were characteristically understated. The response has been significant. Drummond's position is untenable. The English system will move slowly, but it will move. The remainder of the letter detailed the legal progress of the freeze order. The challenges that Castañeda's lawyers had filed in the Antwerp courts, the challenges that had been rejected, the timeline for the formal judicial proceedings that were now scheduled for 6 weeks hence. 6 weeks. Eliza read the letter twice. She thought about the speed of it, the way something that had been immovable for 3 years had begun, in the space of 2 weeks, to move with a momentum that was almost frightening in its acceleration. She thought about Bertrand, writing in his small, dense hand in the study on the Rue des Colonies, methodically closing every door that Castañeda's money had bought open. She thought about London, about her mother. A second letter had arrived in the same delivery, this one in her mother's handwriting, forwarded through the chain Adrian had established for exactly this purpose. She opened it alone, in the small room at the inn while Adrian met with Marco in the courtyard below, and she read it standing by the window with the early Pyrenean light coming in cold and clear. Her mother had written 7 lines. Catherine Rowan was not a woman who used more words than a thing required. I read the broadsheet. I read the counter-narrative 2 days later. I have told everyone who has approached me with an expression of sympathy that I am extremely proud of my daughter and have nothing further to add on the subject. Your father would have been insufferably pleased with you. Come back when you can. I am well. Do not rush on my account. She sat down on the edge of the bed and held the letter for a long time. Insufferably pleased. That was the most completely her father thing her mother had ever said, in 7 lines, without a single wasted word. When Adrian knocked 20 minutes later, she was composed. He came in and looked at her face and said nothing, just looked, with the comprehensive attention he brought to everything, and she showed him the letter. He read it and handed it back and said quietly, "She's remarkable." "Yes," Eliza said, "she is." He held her gaze for a moment, the expression almost reaching its full form, and then, "We should move. The road to the pass is better in the morning." "I know," she said. She folded the letter and put it in her coat close to her. They moved. Spain received them through the Pyrenean Pass on a morning that was cold and luminous, the mountains enormous and indifferent around them, the sky above a shade of blue that did not exist in England, deeper, more absolute, as if at this altitude the atmosphere had burned away its uncertainty. She had never been to Spain. She had not known, until she arrived, that it would feel like this, like a country that had decided, somewhere in its long and complicated history, that grandeur was simply the baseline. The light was different here. The air smelled of something she couldn't name, stone and pine and the faint mineral sharpness of altitude. The road descended from the pass into a landscape of red earth and terraced hills and ancient olive trees, and she looked at it with the particular attention of someone who understood that they were looking at a place they might come to know well. Adrian, beside her in the carriage, was watching the landscape with a different quality of attention. She recognized it, had seen something like it in Brussels when Bertrand signed the freeze order, but more concentrated now. The attention of a man approaching something that was simultaneously home and wound, the place where the worst thing had happened, and also the place where everything worth fighting for was rooted. "When did you last see it?" she asked. 3 years ago, the day I left." He paused. "I stood at the top of that pass and I looked back. I told myself I wouldn't look back again until I had what I needed to return." She said nothing. Let it be what it was. "It's still there," he said, almost to himself. Looking at the olive terraces, the red earth, the particular quality of the southern Spanish light. "I wasn't sure it would be." "It was always going to be there," she said. "That's what places are." He looked at her. Something in his expression settled. "Yes," he said, "that's what places are." The first witness was a man named Tomas Vega, a former estate manager who had worked for the Velasco family for 30 years and had been present, at a distance, on the road between Cadiz and Seville on the night Rodrigo Velasco died. He was 61, a compact and weathered man who lived in a farmhouse outside a village called Arcos, and he opened his door to Adrian's knock with an expression that contained everything a face can contain when it sees someone it had believed it might never see again. The 2 men stood in the doorway for a moment that required nothing from either of them. Not words, not explanation, simply the acknowledgement of what had passed and what had been survived and what was now, finally, different. Come in, Tomas said. Both of you. They sat at a kitchen table in a room that smelled of bread and wood smoke, and Tomas told them what he had never been able to tell anyone in 3 years because no channel had been safe, no ear had been trustworthy. What he had seen on the road that night. His voice was steady. He had been carrying this for a long time, and he had built the muscle for it, the way Georgina Alderton had built the muscle for what she carried, the way Eliza's mother had built it, the way all people who survive the long holding of terrible knowledge eventually do. He had seen Castañeda's men on the road. He had recognized 2 of them. He had not seen the act itself, had arrived too late for that, had found the horse and the fallen man, and understood immediately what he was looking at and what the understanding would cost him if he spoke. He had said nothing for 3 years. He had lived with it. I'll say it now, Tomas said. He looked at Adrian across the table. I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it. I've been waiting for someone to come and tell me it was safe enough. You being here, the news from Belgium that came 2 days ago, the freeze order, the papers. He shook his head. I heard it, and I thought, it's time. It's time, Adrian said. 2 more witnesses over the following 3 days, both in towns within a day's ride of the Velasco estate. Both with pieces of the picture that fit with Tomas's account in the interlocking way of genuine testimony. Not rehearsed, not identical. Real, in the specific, irregular way that truth is always distinguishable from its imitations. She sat with each of them. She took notes, not in any official capacity, but in the practical one of someone with a clear hand and a trained memory who understood the value of a clean record. Adrian watched her do it and said nothing, which meant he trusted her to do it right. She trusted herself. It was a different thing from what she had felt in London. This trust in herself, more solid, less contingent. It did not require anyone else's confirmation to hold. On the 4th day in Spain, they drove to the estate. She had not asked to go. He had not explained why he was taking her. He had simply said, in the morning, come with me today. And she had understood without needing it explained that this was something he needed to do and needed not to do alone. The Velasco estate sat at the end of a long road lined with ancient plane trees, their branches not yet fully leafed in the early spring, but already showing the pale, certain green of new growth at every tip. The main house came into view through the trees, substantial, low, the warm stone color of everything in Andalusia, with a courtyard whose fountain she could hear before she could see it. And at the front of the house, on the steps that led to the main entrance, stood Rodrigo Castañeda. She had been given descriptions, the ledger, Adrian's account, Tomas's words. She had assembled an image. The reality was smaller than she'd imagined and more ordinary in the way that the people who do the worst things often are. A man in his 60s, well-dressed, with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He was not, she observed, afraid. He was watching their carriage come up the drive with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had decided, at some point in the past several days, on a specific response. Marco stopped the carriage. Adrian stepped down. She stepped down beside him. Castañeda looked at her. His expression registered her presence with the slight, dismissive recalibration of a man who had categorized her immediately and comprehensively. "You've come with a woman," he said in Spanish. "I had hoped you'd come with lawyers." "The lawyers are in Antwerp," Adrian said. His voice was entirely level. "And in Madrid. And in London at this point." He looked at Castañeda across the courtyard of the house his father had built. "You know about the freeze order." "I know about a legal action that will be challenged and overturned," Castañeda said. "You've been busy. I'll grant you that. But busy isn't the same as successful, and the document you've stolen from London was given to us," Eliza said. He looked at her. This time, the dismissal was slightly less automatic. "Willingly," she continued, in Spanish that was measured and precise. "By a woman who understood what she was living inside and chose to do something about it. The same way a man in a village called Arcos chose to do something about it. The same way 3 other people in 3 other towns have chosen to do something about it in the past 4 days. She held his gaze directly. "You built your operation on the assumption that frightened people stay frightened. You were wrong about that. Frightened people stay frightened until they have somewhere to put what they know. We gave them somewhere. The silence in the courtyard was very specific. The fountain, the new leaves on the plane trees, a bird somewhere over the rooftops. Castaneda looked at her with the focused, recalibrating attention of a man who had just realized he'd made a category error and was revising. Then he looked at Adrian. This is over one ledger, one woman's testimony. You don't have... I have the estate instruments, Adrian said. I have the forgery analysis from 2 independent document examiners. I have Tomas Vega, who was on the road that night. I have 2 additional witnesses to the meeting between you and my father the day before he died. A meeting you claimed in your account to the authorities had never taken place. He paused. I have Bertrand, and in approximately 3 weeks, I will have a formal judicial hearing in Antwerp before a magistrate who is constitutionally incapable of being bought. He looked at the man who had taken everything from his family, and his voice remained entirely even. And I have stood on a dock in Cadiz in the dark and chosen to believe this was possible for 3 years. That belief has not cost me nothing, but it has cost you everything. Castaneda was quiet. She watched him, watched the calculation running, the assessment of positions, the rapid inventory of resources and options that she had learned to recognize in men who had spent their lives operating from power. She watched him arrive at the conclusion she and Adrian had arrived at 4 days ago in Brussels, that the mechanism was in motion, that it could not be stopped by any action available to him now, that the door had closed. You'll ruin the estate, he said. The legal proceedings will freeze everything. The workers won't be paid, the contracts will be in dispute. I'll run the estate, Adrian said, the way my father ran it, the way his father ran it. He paused. The proceedings will be resolved. Bertrand is thorough. It will not be quick, but it will be complete. He looked at Castaneda for a long moment, the look of a man saying goodbye to something he had needed to stay close to for survival, and could now, finally, begin to release. You will leave this property today. Your access to every account connected to the Velasco name is suspended under the Belgian freeze order, and the Spanish courts have been notified through Bertrand's official request for reciprocal enforcement. He paused once more. There is nothing left for you here. Castaneda looked at him, at the house behind him, at the courtyard and the fountain and the plane trees at the end of the drive. She watched him take the inventory of what he had possessed and what was no longer possessable, and it was not satisfying to watch. It was not the moment of triumph she might have expected, because what she saw on his face was not defeat so much as the arrival of consequence, the long-delayed settling of weight onto someone who had avoided carrying it for too long, and there was something in the witnessing of that which was simply human and heavy and without pleasure. He went inside. They heard him speaking to someone, a servant, instructions, the sounds of a man preparing to leave a place. Marco and Reyes stood at the edges of the courtyard, steady and unobtrusive. 40 minutes later, Castaneda came back down the front steps with 2 men carrying cases, walked to a waiting carriage without looking at Adrian, and drove away down the Plane Tree Road without looking back. She and Adrian stood in the courtyard and watched the carriage until it was gone. The fountain ran. The birds moved over the rooftops. The estate, the house, the outbuildings, the olive groves visible on the hillside to the south, everything that 200 years of one family's work had assembled, was very quiet around them. Adrian stood beside her, and she felt the specific quality of the silence beside him, the silence of something completed, of a door that had been held shut for 3 years finally, at the end of tremendous effort, coming open. Adrian, she said. I know, he said. They stood there for a long time. The early spring light moved across the courtyard stones. Somewhere in the house, she could hear, very faintly, the sounds of the household. People moving, a door, a voice. The sounds of a place that was simply still existing, still running, unchanged in its daily rhythms by the enormous thing that had just happened in its courtyard. Your father built this, she said. He tended it, Adrian said. His father built it. His father's father before that. He looked at the house with the expression she had been waiting to see, not the controlled, managed expression of a man on a campaign, but something simpler and deeper, the expression of a man at home. It was always going to come back to us. I just needed to be the person who came to get it. She looked at him, the light, the stone, the new green at the tips of the plane trees. You said, she said quietly. That there was a question you wanted to ask when we were on the other side. He turned to her. Fully, completely, with the total attention he had brought to her from the first moment. From the ballroom, from the table near the kitchen, from the moment he'd looked across 200 people and seen her sitting in the corner refusing to perform her suffering for an audience. Yes, he said, I did say that. We're on the other side, she said. The courtyard, the fountain, the birds, and the light and the smell of Andalusian stone warmed by the early spring sun. Eliza Rowan, he said. He said her name the way he always said it, not as a social form, not as an address, but as the thing itself. Her. I have spent 3 years believing in something that most people would have abandoned. I have been alone in that belief in ways I did not fully understand until I was no longer alone in them. He paused. Not with uncertainty, but with the deliberateness of a man who has thought about what he wants to say and is saying it exactly. I'm going to rebuild this estate and pursue what remains of this legal case, and eventually, in some number of months that I cannot specify precisely, stand in a court in Antwerp and watch a judge render a verdict that will determine the shape of the rest of my life. He held her eyes. I would like you beside me for all of it, not as a strategy, not as an alliance, as the person I have become unable to imagine doing any of this without. He paused once more. I would like to marry you, if you'll have me. The fountain ran. The light moved. She looked at him, at the face she had learned over 10 days in a channel crossing and 9 days of French road and a Pyrenean pass and an Andalusian courtyard, the face she had learned more fully and more accurately than she had ever learned any face before, because he had never offered her a performance to read and had required only the truth in return. She thought about the ballroom, the corner, the petals, the girl who had arranged herself in the smallest possible space to avoid taking up room that someone might object to. She thought about who she was now, in this courtyard, in this light, what she had done and decided and survived. The shape of herself that had emerged from the pressure of the past weeks. Not a new person, not a transformed one, but the one who had always been there, made visible by circumstance, clarified by opposition, recognized by someone who saw people and could not stop. Yes, she said. He was still for a moment. Then he reached for her hand, the same gesture he had made in the ballroom, in the first moment, covering her gloved hand with his. Except that this time it was not a performance and not a tactic and not anything except exactly what it was. She turned her hand and held his. They were married 6 weeks later. Not in London, not yet. The London ceremony would come, in time, when the legal proceedings had run their course and the dust of scandal had settled into the historical record that all scandals eventually become. But the first marriage was here, in Andalusia, in the village church at the end of the estate road, with Tomas Vega as witness and Marco and Reyes standing at the back and the spring light coming through the old windows in the particular gold of southern Spain. Her mother came from London. Eliza had not asked her to, had written the letter with the expectation of a warm reply and a firm intention to attend the London ceremony instead, because Catherine Rowan was a practical woman who managed her life efficiently and was not given to impulsive journeys. Her mother arrived 4 days before the wedding with 2 trunks and a hat that was entirely wrong for the Andalusian climate and an expression of complete composure that did not, for even a single moment, fool her daughter. They sat in the courtyard on the evening of her arrival, the fountain running between them, the olive dark hills in the distance, the sky going from gold to violet in the long Spanish evening. "He's good," her mother said without preamble. "I know," Eliza said. "Not good in the easy way, good in the way that costs something." She paused. "Your father was like that." Eliza said nothing. She watched her mother look at the courtyard, the fountain, the plane trees, the house, and saw on her mother's face, briefly and unmistakably, something that was not grief but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a life well built, and the bittersweet precision of knowing that the man who would have loved to see it was not here to see it. "He'd have come for the wine," her mother said. "The Velasco vineyards are apparently exceptional." Eliza laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had been producing more easily in recent weeks as the muscles for it came back. "The wine is remarkable," she said. Her mother looked at her then, really looked, with the full attention of a woman who had known her daughter's face for 26 years and was reading the current version of it against every previous one. "You look like yourself," her mother said. "The real version, the one your father always said was in there." "He was right," Eliza said. "He was usually right." A pause. "Don't tell anyone I said that. I spent 20 years managing his ego." They sat in the courtyard as the evening came fully in, and the stars appeared over Andalusia, bright and dense, the country sky with no city to dim it. And Eliza felt the weight and the warmth of the moment with the specific present attention of someone who had learned in the past weeks to be entirely inside the moments she was in. In London, the summer after the wedding, Lord Cassius Drummond resigned from the Privy Council's Trade Advisory Board, citing health. No official criminal proceeding advanced against him in England. Adrian had been right about the establishment's capacity for protecting its own, but his financial connection to Castañeda's operation was in the public record, and the public record was permanent. He was, in the specific English manner, not prosecuted but rendered socially invisible, which was, in its own way, a complete erasure of everything he had constructed. Rodrigo Castañeda was tried before Bertrand's court in Antwerp in the second week of September. The proceedings lasted 8 days. Tomás Vega testified. 2 additional witnesses testified. The forged estate instruments were entered into evidence and examined by 3 independent experts, all of whom reached the same conclusion. The green ledger was entered into evidence. The chain of possession was documented cleanly and completely from Georgina Alderton's shelf to the brown paper parcel to the hands of a magistrate who had never in his career taken a shortcut. The verdict took 4 hours. Eliza and Adrian were in the courtroom when it came. She had not been required to be there. Her role in the proceedings had been fully documented, her witness statement submitted months prior. She was there because she wanted to be. Because she had carried the ledger from London to Antwerp to Brussels, and she intended to be present when it reached its full weight. The verdict was delivered in French, which Bertrand had explained was the language of the court's jurisdiction, and she understood enough of it to follow. And what she couldn't follow, she read in Adrian's face beside her as the words landed one by one. Complete finding of fraud. Full restitution of the Velasco estate and assets. Criminal referral to Spanish authorities for the matter of Rodrigo Velasco's death. Castañeda, at the defendant's table, said nothing. He sat with the stillness of a man who had run out of maneuvers and arrived, at the end of all of them, at the consequence he had spent 3 years trying to outrun. Adrian did not speak either. He sat beside her with his hands resting on the table in front of him, and she watched his face as the verdict finished, and she saw, past the control, past the management, past the 3 years of contained purpose, the thing that had been underneath all of it. Not triumph, not vindication exactly. Something quieter and more complete. The expression of a man who has done what he said he would do for the person he said he would do it for. She took his hand. He held hers the way he always held hers, with the grip of someone holding something real. Bertrand, gathering his papers at the front of the room, glanced at them once over his spectacles. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, and the situation was formally solemn, and he had the professional dignity of someone who understood that verdicts were not occasions for personal satisfaction in public. But something in his expression, when he looked at them, had the quality of a man who was, privately and in the depths of a career spent pursuing the necessary and difficult thing, satisfied. He looked away, returned to his papers. The business of the court went on. 2 years after the wedding in the village church, the Velasco estate in Andalusia was producing wine and olive oil and the particular quality of organized, purposeful work that a well-run estate generates, the kind of productivity that improves the lives of the people who live and work within it, that builds outward rather than inward, that is recognizable in the faces of people who have steady work and fair treatment and can see the shape of their futures. She and Adrian lived there. Not only there, London received them each year, and her mother's house in the city was a constant in their calendar, and Brussels had become a place they visited because Bertrand had become, in the odd way that people become things over time, something approaching a friend. But Andalusia was home. in the way that home is the place where your life is organized around the things that matter, rather than the things that are expected. She ran the household accounts with the same strategic attention she had brought to the problem of exposing Castaneda, found that an estate of this scale was, in its way, a puzzle not unlike the ones she had learned to solve under pressure. She made mistakes, corrected them, learned the specific knowledge of this land and its rhythms. She became known in the village, known by her own qualities, not by anyone else's assessment of her. She was recognized for what she was. This seemed, from the outside, like a simple thing. She knew it was not. She wrote to Georgina Alderton twice a year. Georgina had remained in Yorkshire, had not returned to London, had not returned to her husband, had instead begun the quiet, independent life of a woman who had made a decision and intended to live in it fully. Her letters were warm and slightly formal, and occasionally funny, and Eliza treasured them with the particular warmth she felt for people who had chosen the harder right thing over the easier available one. One afternoon in the second year, a warm October afternoon, the harvest nearly in, the light on the olive groves, the particular amber of late Andalusian autumn, she sat on the bench in the courtyard where she and Adrian had stood on the first day, where the fountain still ran and the plane trees were fully leafed now and showed the first edges of gold at their tips. Adrian came and sat beside her. They had been married for 2 years, and she had learned him fully in the way you learn someone you live beside. Not the version of learning that happens in crisis, which is fast and intense and strips things to their essentials, but the slower, deeper learning of ordinary days. She knew the quality of his silence in the morning before he spoke. She knew how he held a cup of coffee when he was thinking through a problem, and how he held it when he was simply present. She knew the way he watched the olive workers at harvest, and the way he still, sometimes, stood at the edge of the property and looked across the red earth in the direction of the road to Cadiz. Not with grief anymore, mostly, but with the particular attention of a man who had not forgotten where he had come from or what the forgetting would cost. She knew, because he had told her on a night in the first year when the telling seemed necessary, that the criminal referral to Spanish authorities for his father's death had resulted in a charge, but not yet a conviction, that the Spanish system moved in its own time and the outcome was not certain. He carried this. She watched him carry it. She did not tell him it would resolve in the way she hoped it would, because she had learned, from him, from her father, from Bertrand and Tomas and Georgina Alderton and the various people she had met in the course of the past 2 years who had survived difficult things, that what people who are carrying something need is not reassurance. What they need is company. She was his company. He was hers. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The ballroom," she said. He looked at her. "The gardenias," she said. "I keep thinking about them differently now. At the time they felt like a cruelty, someone else's proof of my humiliation. But I think about them now and I think, without them I would have been sitting somewhere else in the room. And you were looking for something specific. You might not have found me." He was quiet for a moment. "I would have found you," he said. "You don't know that." "I would have found you," he said again, with the quiet certainty that was one of the things she loved most about him. Not stubbornness, not wishful thinking, but the specific conviction of a man who had spent 3 years deciding what was worth believing and had gotten good at knowing the difference. The particular quality of how you were sitting in that room, refusing to collapse, refusing to perform, refusing to be what they needed you to be. That was visible from anywhere in the room. He paused. "I was looking for an ally. I found something else." "What?" He looked at her in the courtyard of his father's house, in the Andalusian autumn light, with 2 years of ordinary and extraordinary life between them and whatever came next, not yet visible, but not, for the first time in a long time, frightening. "The real story," he said. "The one worth knowing." Her father had said that. The real story is always underneath. She had told Adrian about it months ago, and he had absorbed it in the way he absorbed everything she offered, not as information, but as something to think with, to build on, to return to when it connected with something new. She had not expected it to come back to her like this. In this light, in this courtyard, in this life that she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not trade for the safest version of the alternative. "Yes," she said, "that's what it is." The fountain ran between them. The plane trees moved in the light afternoon wind, their gold-tipped leaves turning and catching the sun. Somewhere on the estate, someone was laughing. A full, uncomplicated laugh. The kind that carries because nothing is being held back. Eliza could not tell who it was from this distance. She could tell only that it was real. She leaned into Adrian's shoulder and he put his arm around her with the unthinking ease of someone for whom the gesture had become the simplest thing in the world. The afternoon light moved across the courtyard stones. The harvest was nearly in. The years were ahead of them, full and uncertain, and theirs. The woman who had once sat near a kitchen entrance and counted petals did not count anything now. She was not managing her space or arranging her face or calibrating the size of herself against the size of what was permitted. She was entirely present, in the sun, in the life she had built out of a decision made at the bottom of everything. The decision to stand up, to take an arm, to step into the center of the room and refuse to be subtracted from her own story. She was a duchess. She had helped reclaim an empire. She had crossed a sea and a mountain range and walked into a murderer's courtyard with a green ledger and the specific, unbreakable courage of a woman who had run out of smaller options. And the man who had once asked her to pretend, the man with the still eyes and the careful hands and the question he had saved until there was clear sky to ask it in, was beside her now in the Andalusian afternoon and would be beside her tomorrow, and was already, in every way that the word meant anything, home. The real story was always underneath. This was it. This was always it.